Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the stone-cold heart of a medieval castle. Literally, and you probably won't survive this. Okay, you will, but only because you've got the luxury of central heating, synthetic blankets, and the blessed option to microwave a cup of tea at 2 a.m. Back then, not so much. Picture this. It's the dead of winter in 1327, your castle walls are 5 feet thick and made entirely of stone, and outside the wind is howling like a pack of banshees. Inside is not much better. The fire in the hall has burned down to sad red coals, and the one candle in your room does more to mock the darkness than defeat it. You've got a bed, but it's about as warm as a tomb, and not nearly as cosy. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I mean, no pressure. But it helps keep the fires stoked, if you catch my drift. Oh, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. Always fun to know who else is sleepless with me. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You press your palm against the inside of the castle wall and feel the chill bite through your skin like it's got teeth. Stone holds cold like it's hoarding treasure, and since insulation won't be invented for another several centuries, every gust of wind that creeps through the window cracks is coming straight for your spine. The torchlight in the corridor flickers as you pass by, feet muffled against the rush-covered floor. It's quiet mostly, except for the scurry of something small in the rafters and the occasional groan of the ancient beams. You make your way toward the great hall, where the central hearth still holds a little life. During the day, this space buzzes with activity. Cooks clanging pots, knights bragging about their bruises, and servants darting in and out like nervous rabbits. But at night, the hall turns ghostly. Just the faint smell of smoke, wood, and meat lingers. The fire was once the heart of the castle, but it was a crude and inefficient heart, losing most of its heat to the high ceilings and thick walls. You get a little closer to the hearth. The warmth here is nice, if you crouch right next to it, but unless you're planning to sleep curled up like a cat on the stone floor, and honestly, some probably did, this isn't where the night ends. The real challenge? Surviving the bedroom. Medieval castles weren't built for comfort. They were built for defense, dominance, and a kind of brute force architectural awe. But not warmth. Your room is on the upper floor, tucked into a turret or off a long, dark hallway that's more dungeon than domestic. There's a narrow arrow-slit window with a wooden shutter, maybe a thick animal silk or animal skin nailed across it to keep out the worst of the draft. Maybe, if you're lucky, you slip into the room and shut the heavy wooden door behind you, pushing a wedge of cloth into the crack beneath it. It's something people really did, stuffing cloth or straw to block the cold air sneaking under the door. Every little thing helped. You look around, the walls are bare stone, but a tapestry or two flutters gently in the draught. They're not just there for decoration. Tapestries were medieval insulation, hanging wool or linen on the walls to slow the flow of cold air and make the space feel a little less like a tomb. Your bed sits in the corner, a high wooden frame that creaks when you sit on it. Feather mattress, maybe, if you're high up in the pecking order. Otherwise, you're dealing with straw and coarse wool. A canopy hangs above, draped in thick curtains. It's not just for romance or drama, it's practical. Closing those curtains traps your body heat inside, creating a mini hotbox in an otherwise freezing room. In a sense, it's like sleeping inside your own insulated tent. Now here's a quirky little side note, and medieval people often slept with their clothes on. Not out of laziness or some weird fashion rule, but out of necessity. You don't peel off your layers when the temperature inside is just a few degrees warmer than outside. Night shirts, woolen leggings, thick socks, and even sleeping caps were normal bedtime wear. The myth of the nightgown-clad sleeper under a paper-thin sheet, that's a Victorian fantasy. In a castle, you sleep like you're camping during a frost advisory. And here's something you might not expect. A lot of people didn't sleep alone. No, not like that. Get your mind out of the medieval gutter. Shared beds were common. Families, servants, even guests might share a bed, not just for space saving, but for warmth. Body heat was the original central heating. If you've ever tried to sleep in a cold room with just one dog under the covers, imagine 4 people, a goat and maybe a chicken all trying to warm up a single straw mattress. Cozy. Of course, you might be wondering, didn't they just build fires in every room? Not really. Fires were expensive, required constant maintenance, and were risky. Sparks and straw floors don't mix, plus chimneys weren't widespread until late in the medieval period. Before that, smoke just hung out. You'd end up warm, sure, but also coughing like you'd swallowed a peat bog. Oh, and here's a spicy debate among historians. How much did people really mind the cold? Some argue they were just tougher, more acclimated. After all, their lives were rough all around. Others believe they absolutely hated it and did everything possible to avoid it, but just lacked the tech. We may never know if they simply coped or constantly complained in their journals, assuming they could write. You pull the curtains closed around your bed, tuck your freezing under a scratchy wool blanket and exhale a cloud of breath into the darkness. The fire's too far away, the wind still whispers through the shutters. Somewhere in the distance a hound barks once, then stops. You curl in tighter and wait for the warmth to build. Tomorrow you'll wake stiff and probably half frozen. But tonight, you survive. Barely. It's morning now. Well, sort of. In a castle, there's no gentle sunrise streaming through bay windows. You wake to the sound of bells clanging somewhere deep in the keep, echoing up through stone staircases and groaning corridors. The light in your room is bluish-grey and barely there, filtering in through the sliver of a window, covered with oiled parchment or thick cloth, depending on what century you're in or how wealthy your lord happens to be. You're stiff, sore, and colder than you were last night, which honestly feels like an achievement, and your breath still fogs in front of your face. You push back the weight of wool blankets and animal furs and swing your legs over the side of the bed. The wooden floor is cold enough to make your bones scream. No surprise there. The whole castle is a freezer disguised as a fortress, and you're waking up in the meat locker section. But it wasn't poor planning. It's just that medieval castles weren't built for all warmth. They were built to not get invaded. And apparently if that meant you froze to death during a siege instead of being stabbed, that was still considered a win. Let's talk about these icy stone prisons. A lot of people romanticize castles, turrets, moats, the clink of armour in candlelit halls. But what they don't think about is how those walls, often several feet thick and made of raw stone, acted like giant thermal batteries for the cold. They absorbed the chill all winter long and radiated it into the rooms like nature's air conditioner, but in the worst way possible. No insulation, no plastered interiors in many rooms, and absolutely no understanding of thermal efficiency. Architects back then didn't care about your toes. They cared about battlements, archery slits, and being able to dump boiling oil on intruders. You shuffle across the room, wrap a cloak around yourself, and crack open the window shutter to get a sense of the day. Immediately, a blast of icy wind slaps you awake. Congratulations, you're fully conscious now. Outside, it's grey and miserable, and you can see your breath even while standing indoors. You shut the window fast and swear softly in your head, or out loud, depending on how cold your soul feels. The truth is, no matter how majestic a castle looks from the outside, it's a brutal place to live in during the colder months. And some castles were worse than others. Early motte and bailey structures, those wooden fortresses built on man-made hills, offered almost no protection from the cold. Later stone castles were a bit more substantial, but the upgrades were defensive, not domestic. You're still stuck in a box of stone, just a heavier one. There's a reason why so many people in the Middle Ages hung thick tapestries on the walls and laid down rushes or straw on the floors. These weren't just aesthetic choices. Wall hangings helped block cold air from seeping through the cracks in the stone, while floor coverings insulated your feet from the freezing ground below. Of course, those rushes weren't exactly sanitary. They weren't swapped out often, and underneath them lurked all sorts of surprises. Dropped food, bits of bone, and the occasional insect kingdom, but they helped. And when you're dealing with medieval winter, you'll take the trade-off. Now, one weird but fascinating detail. Castle windows rarely had glass. It was expensive, fragile, and mostly reserved for churches or extremely rich nobles. Most windows had wooden shutters, which you'd close tight at night, or thin sheets of horn, animal bladder, or oiled linen stretched across the frame to let in light while keeping out drafts. Effective? Barely, but it was better than leaving a gaping hole in the wall. And remember, most castles were built on high ground, so they were directly exposed to the worst of the wind. You were basically living in a very scenic wind tunnel. You head down to the main hall, drawn by the smell of something cooking, maybe bread or stew, or maybe your imagination is just desperate to conjure warmth. The central hearth has been reignited, smoke curling lazily toward the high ceiling, which is blackened with soot. You hover near it like a moth, stretching your hands toward the flames and resisting the urge to shove your entire face into the fire. This is the one place in the castle that feels slightly warm. Not cozy, let's not get carried away, but at least not instantly frostbitten. The Great Hall fire was the communal heating unit. Everyone, servants, knights, cooks, children, huddled around it during waking hours. It was the social centre, the literal and figurative hearth of the household. The problem? It only helped the people who stayed nearby. The moment you stepped out of its radius, the chill returned like a personal vendetta. Let's talk real numbers for a second. Historical reconstructions and experimental archaeology suggest that even with a roaring fire, the average room temperature in a medieval castle during winter hovered somewhere between 5 to 10 degrees Celsius, around 40 to 50 Fahrenheit. That's if you were lucky. That's also why your nightcap wasn't just a cute accessory, it kept your ears from freezing off while you slept. Every part of you had to be bundled or buried, but not everyone suffered equally. The lord and lady of the castle might enjoy a private chamber with a fireplace, wall hangings, and a thick feather mattress. You might be sleeping in a corridor with 20 others, tucked behind a curtain, your feet wrapped in burlap, or worse, in a drafty corner near the stables. Now, here's the debate. Were castles colder than peasant cottages? The intuitive answer is no. Castles are fancier, right? But in reality, thatch-roofed homes, though tiny and smoky, were often warmer because they were low to the ground, tightly packed with people and animals, and insulated by wattle and daub walls. Meanwhile, castles had height, drafty stone walls, and open spaces that were beautiful but absolutely terrible for holding heat. It's like comparing a well-packed tent to a cathedral. One may be humble, but at least it doesn't have a 30-foot ceiling to trap all the warm air up where you can't reach it. You settle on a bench near the hearth and watch the flames flicker. Someone's dog curls up nearby, radiating heat like a furry furnace. You think about the night to come and how you might double up your layers or sneak a hot brick into your bed. Because while the castle may look like a fortress on the outside, inside, it's a battle against the cold every single night. By late afternoon, the castle starts to stir with renewed life. You hear the clatter of pots in the kitchens, the rhythmic thud of someone chopping wood in the courtyard, and the occasional shout echoing down from the ramparts. You're wrapped in your cloak, still half thawed from the fire in the Great Hall, and now heading up a narrow spiral staircase to check out one of the more private bedchambers, if only to warm your feet near someone else's fire. Most medieval castles didn't have fireplaces in room. That would have been a luxury bordering on sorcery. But by the later Middle Ages, wealthier lords and ladies did start to have personal hearths in their chambers, usually built into the outer wall with a flue that led up through the tower. You reach the top of the stairs and push open a heavy wooden door, greeted by the sharp scent of burning wood and a small but lively fire in a squat stone hearth. The room is still chilly, this isn't the Four Seasons, but compared to the Arctic wind tunnels downstairs, it's downright inviting. This is where you get a good look at the heart of medieval heating, the open fire. No radiators, no furnaces, and absolutely no heated floors, unless you're counting the times when the rushes on the floor accidentally caught fire. The fireplace in front of you is wide and low, and you can see a servant crouched next to it feeding it split logs and poking at the embers with a long iron rod. There's no grate, just a flat stone hearth and whatever clever arrangement of logs you can manage to keep it going. Open hearths like this were the default heating system, but they were wildly inefficient. Most of the heat went straight up the chimney. In fact, chimneys themselves were a pretty recent innovation in the Middle Ages early on. Smoke just escaped through a hole in the roof, or worse, filtered through the rafters into your face. Your eyes would water, your clothes would stink, and you'd go to bed smelling like a burnt ham shank. But on the bright side, the smoke killed off a lot of bugs. Silver linings. You step over to the fire and hold out your hands. The warmth is immediate and delicious, like finally being noticed by the sun. This is why the wealthier folk didn't just sleep in these rooms, they lived in them. A chamber like this, with its fire, thick curtains, wall tapestries and layered rugs, was your winter sanctuary. Everything in it was geared towards survival, though not in the bleak post-apocalyptic sense. No, this was medieval cozy, low-lit, smoky, quiet and functional. The goal wasn't to banish the cold, just to keep it at bay. Let's talk about fuel for a second, because staying warm didn't come cheap. Wood had to be gathered, chopped and dried, and the sheer volume needed to keep a castle fire going all winter was staggering. A single large fire could devour a small tree in less than a week. That meant entire forests were essentially dedicated to heating the homes of nobility and churchmen. Peasants often had to make do with less, burning peat, dried dung, or whatever scraps they could forage. Not the most fragrant of heating methods, but heat is heat when you're one frostbite away from losing your nose. As you watch the fire flicker, you start to understand the delicate balance they had to strike. Let the fire burn too low and the room became an icebox. Stoke it too high and you risked sparks jumping into your rushes or curtains, starting a blaze that might take down the whole tower. Fire was comfort, but also danger. That's why sleeping fires were often banked, meaning they were covered with the ashes to keep the coals alive but controlled through the night. That way you could restart them in the morning without needing a new flame. Here's a quirky little fact for you. Sometimes embers were carefully carried from room to room using special containers, basically medieval fire Tupperware. And if you were really posh, you might have a servant whose job it was to tend to your personal fire throughout the night. Imagine that, your own heat butler. Now, scholars argue about just how much warmth these personal chambers really retained. Some believe that, thanks to the heavy wall hangings, thick curtains and animal skin rugs, a well-appointed room could stay reasonably warm for hours after the fire went out. Others argue that heat loss was so fast and the materials so rudimentary that you'd be shivering again before midnight unless someone stayed up to keep feeding logs into the fire like a human woodchucking machine. Theories make sense, honestly. It probably depended on the weather, the room's position in the castle, and how many people were in it. More bodies meant more shared warmth. The bed in this chamber, by the way, is a marvel of tactical coziness. A high four-poster with thick curtains that can be pulled shut completely. It acts like a room within a room. Climb in, close the curtains, and you're instantly in your own warm bubble, sort of. You still need thick woolen blankets, feather mattresses, and preferably a companion, or at least a dog. The bed isn't against an outer wall either. It's nestled into a warmer interior corner, another small but smart decision in the chess game against the cold. Outside the chamber it's starting to snow. You hear the wind pick up again, rattling the shutters and making the fire hiss softly as cold air creeps in through the stonework. You pull your cloak tighter, then reach for a goblet of mulled wine someone left nearby. It's lukewarm now, but still spicy and comforting. The blend of cinnamon, clove, and whatever medieval approximation of citrus they had going on warms your chest on the way down. They didn't have thermoses, but they knew a thing or two about using drink as insulation. Before you leave the chamber, you notice one more detail. A warming pan hanging by the wall. It's a shallow metal container with a long handle, filled with hot coals and meant to be slid between the sheets before bed. Not for you to sleep with, unless you're into spontaneous combustion, but for preheating the bed. You imagine a servant moving from chamber to chamber, warming sheets while everyone else finishes supper. A literal bed warmer. Today we use electric blankets. Back then it was hot metal and a prayer. You give the fire one last long look before stepping back into the corridor. The warmth clings to you for a few seconds before the stone chill swallows it whole. You know tonight you'll return here, or somewhere like it, and wrap yourself in every layer you own. Maybe toss a few hot stones into the foot of the bed if you're lucky. The fire may be small, the chamber chilly, and the wind relentless. But in this world of cold stone and colder nights, every ember is a small miracle. You head back down the spiral stairs, the smooth stone worn into shallow dips from centuries of footsteps, bare feet, armoured boots, slippered nobles, and now yours. The chill wraps itself around you again as you descend, like a damp wool cloak you can't shake off. It's getting darker outside, and you know what that means. The real cold is about to set in. Medieval castles weren't exactly known for their nightlife, unless you count the occasional feast, ghostly moans, or someone vomiting out a window. But once the sun dropped below the horizon, survival wasn't about entertainment. It was about hunkering down and keeping every last scrap of heat inside your clothes, your bed, and your bones. You slip into another room, this one smaller, tucked between the chapel and the Lord's solar. It's a private sleeping space for someone important but not top tier, maybe a steward or a high-ranking knight. There's no fireplace here, but the walls are hung with thick woolen tapestries, and the tiny window has not just a shutter, but a heavy curtain nailed around the frame. That's no accident. The people who slept in rooms like this knew how to squeeze every degree of warmth out of their surroundings. And the biggest trick of all? Location, location, location. Bedrooms in medieval castles weren't randomly assigned. The lord and lady got the warmest, most central room, usually on an upper floor, close to the hearths and away from wind-exposed walls. Their bedchamber might even be next to the kitchen or above a bakehouse. Why? Because ovens radiated heat, and in a world without insulation, that ambient warmth was pure gold. Smart households made a map of warmth, using human activity, fires, and even livestock to keep their living quarters bearable. If you were savvy, you didn't sleep in the draftiest tower just because it had a nice view. You curled up in the warm belly of the castle like a hibernating animal. And speaking of animal instincts, your body knows what to do. You don't need science to understand that heat rises. So you notice that people tend to sleep in the upper levels of the castle where possible. The lower floors, the ones closest to the icy stone ground, are brutal in winter. They're for storage, servants, or keeping the wine from freezing. Bedrooms are tucked away higher up, surrounded by other rooms like a warm sandwich. This isn't just about comfort, it's calculated defense against frostbite. Then there's the issue of doors. Every room you enter has a door as thick as your forearm and usually lined with some kind of fabric, animal hide, or at the very least a tightly woven draft guard along the bottom. It's all about sealing and heat. Think about how much cold sneaks under a door in your modern house. Now imagine a medieval castle with no weather stripping, constant wind, and gaps big enough to see daylight through. If you didn't take steps to block that airflow, your teeth would be chattering before you even hit the mattress. And windows? Oh boy. We mentioned earlier that most weren't glass, at least not until the very late Middle Ages, but even if you were in the 15th century and rich enough to afford some early wavy panes of blown glass, they were single thick and terrible at insulating. That's why even fancy rooms had layers. Glass, if you were lucky, then wooden shutters, then fabric curtains. You basically wrapped your windows like birthday presents and hoped they didn't leak. And no, there was no caulking. The best you could do was cram moss or straw in the cracks and pray it didn't mould before spring. As you crossed the room, your feet crunched softly on the rushes spread across the floor. Rushes were cut reeds or grasses, often mixed with herbs like lavender or mint, not just for the scent, but because those herbs repelled bugs. Over time, the layers built up and compacted into a surprisingly decent insulator. Gross? Definitely. Effective? Weirdly, yes. The floor might still be cold, but it's not bare stone cold. You take a few more steps and imagine what it must have been like to kneel beside this bed in the dead of winter, hands clasped, asking a probably shivering god to make the frost go easy on your toes. Let's zoom out for a second. One of the most fascinating things about medieval room placement is how strategic it was. Bedchambers weren't scattered haphazardly across the keep. They were often clustered around warmer zones, above kitchens, near hearths, close to livestock pens, and always behind thick inner walls. Even the orientation of the room mattered. If possible, rooms were positioned to avoid the prevailing wind. In Northern Europe, that meant south-facing chambers were prized, not for the view, but for the precious fleeting sunlight they might catch. And now for the fringe fact of the day. Some castles had warming rooms. These were dedicated chambers, usually near the kitchens or laundry areas, where fires were kept burning around the clock. People would pop in to warm up, especially before bed. In monasteries, these rooms were essential. Imagine a bunch of monks trying to copy manuscripts with frozen fingers. Warming rooms were their salvation, and the idea eventually spread to manor houses and even castles. They weren't always luxurious, but they were popular hangouts for the perpetually freezing. Back in your borrowed bedchamber, you pull aside the curtain and look at the bed. It's smaller than the Lord's, but still raised off the floor, a crucial detail. Beds weren't just about comfort. They were part of the insulation strategy. Heat rises, cold sinks, and the floor is always the coldest part of the room. A raised bed on a wooden frame put some distance between you and the freezing draft that slipped along the ground. Even just a few feet made a difference. And let's not forget the underbed storage. Not for shoes, but for chamber pots, warming stones, and the occasional hiding peasant during a siege. Dual-purpose furniture at its finest. There's one more debate worth mentioning here. Were medieval rooms always this cold, or are we just assuming the worst? Some historians argue that we exaggerate the harshness, that with enough wall hangings, warm bodies, and decent firewood, people might have been warmer than we think. Others insist that the chill was relentless and that medieval people just accepted a level of discomfort that would have modern folks crying into their fleece throws. The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in the middle. People adapted, they layered, they strategized, and above all, they didn't have TikTok to keep them up until 2 a.m, so at least they got their segmented sleep in. The shadows in the chamber are growing long now, and somewhere below, you hear the call to supper echoing up through the halls. You pull your cloak tighter and move toward the door, already planning your night strategy. double socks, hot stone wrapped in cloth, maybe sneak into the warming room if you can find it. Because here, in a castle that defends you from invaders but not from the cold, bedtime isn't just about rest, it's about tactical survival. As night falls across the castle once again, you feel that creeping dread settle in your shoulders, the knowledge that no matter how full your belly is after supper, no matter how many layers you're wearing, the real test is still ahead, getting through the night without waking up as a human icicle. You trudge back through the corridors, past stone archways and sputtering torches, until you reach your sleeping chamber. It's a slightly nicer one tonight. You've managed to climb the social ladder just a bit. Maybe you earned favour with the steward, or maybe someone more important than you has decided to sleep elsewhere. Either way, you've got a bed with a canopy and a curtain that mostly closes. Victory. You step inside and immediately pull the heavy curtain across the doorway to trap whatever heat might have accumulated. Not that it's much. The air is already turning damp again, and the faint warmth from the hearth earlier in the day has faded. Still, this room has something special. A proper canopy bed, tall and wooden and draped on all sides with thick dark fabric. If you're modern-minded, your brain might file this under fancy medieval aesthetic, like something out of a Renaissance fair brochure. But back then, these beds were less about style and more about survival. You walk over to the bed and run your hand along the curtain. It's dense, woven wool, dyed deep blue, and lined with sheepskin in places. You pull one side aside and peer into the dark interior of the bed. It's like looking into a tent pitched inside your room. That's exactly the point. You're not just sleeping in a bed, you're sleeping in a cocoon, a microclimate carved out of necessity. The mattress is a mix of feather and straw laid over wooden slats. There's a wool-stuffed bolster at the head and a mess of coarse linen sheets beneath a pile of blankets. You lift one and it's heavier than you expected, more like a tarp than a comforter. These things weren't designed to be breathable. They were meant to trap your body heat and not let it escape until the sun came up. Or, until your chamber pot called. You start to get ready for bed, which in medieval terms doesn't mean stripping down. In fact, it means layering up. You already have on woolen hose, a linen shift, and an undertunic. Over that, you throw on a second wool tunic and thick socks that itch like a plague, but at least they do their job. And finally, the crown jewel of the outfit, a nightcap. Not the kind with a pom-pom and cartoon moons on it, but a practical fitted wool cap that covers your ears and helps keep the heat from fleeing out the top of your head. Because yes, medieval folks knew, long before the Mayo Clinic confirmed it, that heat escapes fast from the scalp, especially when the rest of your body is cocooned like a cabbage. Climbing into the bed is like entering another world. You lift the thick curtain, slip between the blankets, and pull the fabric shut behind you. The space instantly muffles the sound of the hallway and the wind outside. It's still cold, but not as cold. Your own breath starts to warm the air within the tiny space, and after a few minutes the layers of wool and linen begin to do their work. You're not cozy, exactly, but you're no longer freezing. That counts for a lot here. Let's pause for a second to acknowledge just how smart this whole canopy bed system was. It wasn't only the royal elite who used them. Even modest manor homes tried to mimic the design. These beds served as a form of insulation, privacy, and soundproofing all rolled into one. In large halls where several people might sleep in the same room, or even in the same bed, canopies helped carve out a little sanctuary. They also kept out creepy crawlies dropping from the rafters, which, let's just say, was more common than you want to think about at bedtime. And if you're picturing a couple tucked under these blankets, all snug and romantic, well, not always. Sleeping arrangements were often more about practicality than intimacy. Families slept together for warmth. Servants might share beds with one another, or even with their employers, depending on the household. The canopy just meant you could cough, fart, or recite your evening prayers with a shred of privacy. Now here's a fringe fact that gets glossed over in the historical dramas. Some of these beds had enclosed headboards or even had curtains on all sides, including underneath. That's right. You could literally seal yourself in like a medieval burrito. Was it claustrophobic? Probably, but if it meant not waking up with frost on your eyebrows, most folks were fine with a little air deprivation. There's even an ongoing scholarly debate about how widespread these full enclosure beds were. Some would argue that they were reserved for the ultra-rich and the ultra-paranoid. Great for warmth, yes, but also useful if you didn't trust your cousin not to murder you in your sleep. Others suggest that these enclosed sleeping spaces were fairly common among the gentry and well-to-do merchants, especially in drafty homes in colder climates. Either way, the goal was the same: hold the heat in and keep the cold out. In a time before central heating, you had to turn your bed into a furnace. As you lie in bed, wrapped in multiple layers, you feel the stillness settle around you. The room is quiet except for the faint rustle of the wind outside and maybe the soft breathing of someone in the next chamber. You shift slightly, trying to avoid the one spot in the mattress that feels like a sack of potatoes. Your toes finally are starting to warm. Your arms are pinned under blankets so heavy they could double as siege weapons. It's not luxury, but it's not torture either. It's medieval comfort, which is mostly defined by not actively miserable. And now you wait. You wait for the rhythm of your breath to slow. You wait for sleep to find you in the darkness of this woolen tent. You hope the warming pan that was run across your sheets earlier did its job, and that no stray embers have set your bedding smouldering from below. You hope you won't have to pee in the middle of the night because, well, that is a whole other nightmare we'll get to soon. But for now, you're warm, and warm is rare. So you let the silence lull you, and you close your eyes, knowing that this fragile pocket of comfort is the result of centuries of practical design and the quiet desperation of people who refuse to freeze to death in their own homes. It's the middle of the night when you wake up, not because you're startled or because of some eerie castle sound, though those are absolutely happening, but because you've started sweating through your fourth layer of wool. That's right. After hours of shivering and trying to draw every molecule of warmth into your shivering husk of a body, you've crossed some invisible threshold and gone full human stew. One of your legs is burning up while the other feels like it's been dipped in an icy stream. This is the eternal curse of medieval bedtime. Too hot under the covers, too cold above them. You throw off one blanket with all the drama of a stage actor dying of consumption and immediately regret it. The cold air assaults you like an offended ghost. You curl back into your little heat nest, now fully awake, and wonder how people manage to sleep like this for their entire lives. The short answer, layers. So many layers. The medieval version of pyjamas wasn't some loose cotton set from a gift shop. It was a tactical arrangement of textiles that would have made a modern survivalist nod in approval, under your outer blanket, and yes, it's probably made of heavy woven wool or even felted animal hair. You've got another one, and under that, maybe an old cloak. Beneath all this, a linen shirt, thick hose, possibly leg wraps, and of course the nightcap, which by now is probably halfway off your head and twisted around one eye like a tiny woolly blindfold. People in the Middle Ages didn't mess around with bedtime clothing. Linen was the go-to for anything that touched the skin. It was absorbent, breathable, and the easiest fabric to wash, which was crucial in a world where full baths were rare, and laundry was a half-day event involving buckets, boiling water, and prayers. Over that went wool. Always wool. Wool was the miracle fabric of the medieval world. Warm when wet, hard to burn, long-lasting, and insulative. If you had money, your wool was thick and well woven. If not, it was scratchy, and maybe riddled with the occasional flea colony. And here's a little detail you might not have thought about. Mittens. Yes, some people slept with them mittens on. Not fashionable ones with little foxes embroidered on them, but thick, simple hand covers that helped you hold on to whatever body heat your fingers generated. For peasants or folks working in the stables, these might have been actual work gloves. For the better off, they could be woolen and made just for sleep. Think of them as the medieval version of electric hand warmers, minus the electricity and plus a lot of sheep. You lie there, breathing slowly, trying not to disturb the delicate ecosystem of warmth you've created under your blankets. Shift too much, and the heat escapes. Breathe too fast, and the condensation from your own breath will make your pillow damp, which is possibly the most disgusting sensation you can experience in a freezing room. It's all a balancing act. Now, if you're thinking, okay, but surely they could just light a fire and sleep in front of it, think again. Fires were dangerous at night. You couldn't just let one burn unattended. Without a proper chimney or flue, luxuries that weren't standard until later in the medieval period, fires filled rooms with smoke, and that smoke had nowhere to go. That meant coughing, eye-watering, and the possibility of asphyxiation. And if you tried to bring the heat directly into your bed, like with a brazier or a warming pan that still had embers in it, well, congratulations. You just turned your mattress into kindling. That's why warming pans were typically used before bed. Someone, usually a servant or if you were poor yourself, would fill a metal pan with hot coals or sienes and slide it between the sheets for a few minutes. Then, crucially, it was removed. The heat would linger long enough to give you a warm welcome into bed, and if you were lucky, you'd generate enough of your own body heat to keep the feeling going. Some wealthier households used hot bricks wrapped in cloth or bags filled with heated sand or stones placed at the foot of the bed. All of it was ingenious and necessary. And let's not skip over the warm drinks. Before bedtime, people often drank something hot, not for pleasure but for insulation. Mulled wine, hot ale, warmed milk with spices if you could get it. These drinks didn't just settle the stomach. They raised your internal temperature just enough to help fight off the initial chill. There's even speculation that people would eat heavier meals before bed in winter months, the better to feed the internal furnace. Protein and fat were the fuels of the medieval bedtime engine. But here's where things get really human. Despite all the layering, the planning, the furs and fires, medieval people were still cold, like still cold. Letters from the period, journals, and even religious texts talk about shivering through prayers, waking with frozen toes, and feeling your breath turn to ice on your beard. The castle could be majestic during the day, full of power and prestige, but at night it was just a glorified freezer. And unless you were incredibly rich or incredibly lucky, you weren't getting through the winter without a few miserable nights. And yet, somehow they adapted. There's a theory that people in colder climates, especially during the so-called Little Ice Age in the later medieval period, developed a kind of cold endurance. Not biologically, but mentally. You get used to a certain level of discomfort when it's always there. Warmth became a luxury, not a baseline expectation. A good night's sleep didn't mean feeling cozy, it meant not waking up stiff and blue. This gets us to one of the more fascinating open debates among scholars. Did people actually sleep more in the winter? There's some evidence that suggests yes, with longer nights, fewer outdoor obligations, and the general desire to hide from the frost, winter was a time of rest and hibernation. But on the flip side, there were also more night watches, longer religious observances, and fires that had to be constantly tended. So the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. People did what they could, and if they had to wake up every 2 hours to restoke a fire or rearrange the furs, so be it. You roll over slowly and reposition your feet next to the stone that was tucked under the blankets earlier, still faintly warm. You wonder how many people before you have done this exact thing layered themselves like a lasagna, cursed at the cold, and waited patiently for sleep to return. In the quiet of the canopy bed, with the wind still tapping at the shutters like a persistent ghost, you sigh and pull your blankets tighter. There's a dog snoring in the hallway. Somewhere below, a fire crackles in the great hall. And you are, at least for the moment, warm enough. The next morning greets you with a low, grey light that seeps into the chamber like it's apologising for existing. You stretch under the covers and immediately regret it. Your arms brush against cold linen sheets, and your fingertips stiffen instantly. The stone walls surrounding your bed still radiate the chill they absorbed overnight, as if they've been storing it up just to spite you. The fire is long dead, the warming stone at your feet has cooled to the temperature of a corpse, and even the dog that had been curled in the hallway is now gone, probably off to beg scraps in the kitchen. You've got one job now: get out of bed without triggering a full-body shiver spiral. You take a deep breath, throw off the covers, and stand into the cold with all the enthusiasm of a condemned prisoner. Every part of you clenches. Your breath puffs in a visible cloud in front of your face. Your wool socks have slipped halfway down your calves during the night, and the floor rushes have flattened into cold, damp mats. Even the little bit of body heat that had built up inside your canopy bed cave is already vanishing like smoke. But here's the thing, you're still better off than most. Because unlike the servants and workers sleeping in the bowels of the castle, you've got bedding, real bedding, and not just one mouldy fur thrown over some straw in the corner. Bedding was an enormous deal in the Middle Ages. It was expensive, time-consuming to maintain, and very much a marker of status. Rich folks didn't just own beds, they invested in them. And for good reason. Surviving the night without losing toes was a luxury, not a guarantee. Let's break it down. The mattress? It wasn't the plush, cloud-like fantasy you might be used to, but it was a start. Most medieval mattresses were large sacks filled with straw, wool, feathers, or some combination of the three. Straw was cheapest, and you would find it in the beds of peasants or low-ranking servants. It needed to be changed out regularly, or not if you had a high tolerance for mould and mites. Wool was warmer but denser, better for colder climates and people with some coin. Feathers were top tier. A featherbed was the medieval equivalent of a memory foam luxury mattress. Soft, insulating. and so rare that they often appeared in wills and dowries. Seriously. People passed down featherbeds like they were family jewels. You shuffle over to the window, open the wooden shutter a crack and peer out. The light is soft but sharp, snow dusting the landscape below, like flour on brie dough. You shut the window again quickly. The cold hits your face like a slap, and turn back toward the bed to examine your bedding further. The bottom sheet is linen, clean, relatively smooth, and surprisingly soft. Linen was used everywhere in the medieval world, not just for clothes but for bed coverings, and it was valued for its breathability and ease of washing. You didn't exactly want to sleep on wool directly, unless you liked the sensation of being slowly exfoliated to death. Over the linen sheet is a series of blankets layered like geological strata. First comes the light wool, then heavier wool, then maybe a fur, and finally, if you're particularly blessed, a coverlet, embroidered, quilted, or even stuffed with down. These topmost layers weren't just for warmth, they were status symbols. Bright colours, embroidered edges, imported fabric trims, these were subtle flexes, medieval style. The lord of the manor didn't just sleep warmer than you, he slept in style. And now we come to the furs. Ah yes, animal skins, medieval bedtime MVPs. It wasn't uncommon for people to throw sheepskin, deerskin, or even more exotic pelts like fox, sable, or ermine over their beds for extra warmth. These were not just functional, they were fashion statements, especially for nobles. Nothing said, I'm important enough to sleep like a bear, quite like draping a lynx over your blankets. Though let's be real, some of the fancier fur choices were probably more symbolic than practical. You weren't exactly curling up under a full peacock pelt for warmth. One slightly unhinged historical tidbit: some households had rules about who was allowed to touch certain bedding items. A noblewoman's fur-lined coverlet might be off limits to anyone below a certain rank. Servants who laid out or removed these layers had to wear gloves or use cloths to avoid direct contact. Because in the cold everything becomes precious, including the very thing keeping your kidneys from freezing solid. There's another layer most people forget: the bolster. This is a long, sausage-shaped pillow stuffed with wool or feathers that sits at the head of the bed. Not only does it lift your upper body, a medieval form of anti-snoring tech, but it also helps insulate your neck and shoulders. On top of that, you might have smaller pillows, yes, plural. Pillows weren't just for comfort, they were insulation. You could tuck one behind your back, one between your knees, one under your feet. The idea was to keep air from circulating too freely around you. Cold air is crafty. Give it a crack to slip through, and it will find your belly button at 3 in the morning. This, of course, brings us to this question. Were beds the same everywhere? Nope. Beds in Northern Europe look different than those in Mediterranean climates. In southern regions, beds were often lighter and more open, built for airflow in the warmer seasons. But in chillier places like England, France and Germany, beds were heavy, thick, and often so tall they required a footstool. Some were even boxed in on 3 sides with wood, essentially building a small wooden room within the room. These weren't just for decoration, they were thermal shells, like the sleeping pods of a much stinkier, smokier spaceship. Here's where scholarly debate kicks in. Some experts argue that medieval beds, even the best of them, couldn't retain heat for more than a few hours unless you had someone sharing it with you. Others believe that once pre-warmed with a pan and sealed tight with curtains and furs, they held enough warmth to make it through the night. The evidence is inconclusive, largely because most medieval people didn't leave Yelp reviews of their bedding. But the consensus is this: if you had access to proper layers, kept your curtains shut, and weren't sleeping beside a broken window or an open chimney, you had a fighting chance of staying warm enough to sleep without shaking like a leaf. You finish making the bed with your stiff, half-numb fingers, smoothing the top blanket with a practiced hand. The room still holds a lingering draft, but it's tolerable, the kind of cold that nibbles rather than bites. And for a moment, standing in the dim, flickering light, you understand how people could make peace with this. The bedding wasn't just survival gear, it was armor. Armor against the night, against the frost, against the long, slow hours between sunset and sunrise when all you could do was lie still and hope your fire and your body held on. It's well past dusk again, and this time you're not alone. You've been assigned to sleep in a shared chamber, a long, narrow room with low ceilings, and just enough space for 3 beds and a thin path between them. One flickering oil lamp lights the space, throwing shadows on the stone walls that seem to dance and twitch like they're trying to escape. A draught squeezes through the shuttered window and curls around your ankles like a mischievous cat. This isn't your own private cocoon of warmth anymore. Tonight, you're sharing heat the old-fashioned way, with people. You eye the other occupants of the room. A tired-looking woman is already tucked into one of the beds, her bonnet tied tightly and a heavy woolen shawl pulled over her chin. A younger boy, maybe a page or a servant, lies in another bed, curled like a shrimp under a pile of patched-up blankets. Your own bed isn't much, Vobomir, just a straw-filled mattress on a low wooden frame, a single thin pillow, and a wool blanket that smells faintly of smoke and something less charming, maybe wet dog. But you know by now that the real trick to surviving the night isn't in what you have, it's in who you sleep near. Sleeping in groups wasn't a quirk of peasant life or a desperate act during travel. It was a deliberate, time-tested strategy to fight the cold. Whether it was entire families piled together in a single bed, or soldiers lined up like firewood in a barrack, the principle was the same. Body heat is better when shared. And in a world where central heating didn't exist, the warmth of another human was a literal lifesaver. You slide into bed fully clothed again, the mattress crunches under your weight, the straw inside packed unevenly, with a few mystery lumps you don't ask questions about. The wool blanket is scratchy, but it holds heat well once you give it a few minutes. Across the narrow aisle, the boy coughs and pulls the blanket tighter around his shoulders. The older woman has already gone still, her breathing deep and regular. You can hear it, along with the soft wind rattling the shutters, and somewhere deeper in the castle, the faint sound of boots on stone. In richer households, group sleeping could still be common, especially during travel. A nobleman on the road might share his bed with a trusted squire, his servant, or even a guest. This wasn't seen as improper or strange. In fact, it was expected. Beds were scarce, and warmth was precious. Even royalty didn't always sleep alone. Historical records include kings sharing beds with other men, not romantically, but practically. It was about proximity, safety, and warmth. Nothing more. In the peasant world, though, bed sharing was an everyday norm. A couple, their children, and sometimes even grandparents might all sleep in one big bed, or several lined up beside each other. And in some homes, especially longhouses or cottages, animals would be just a few feet away, or even right there, lying on the floor next to the bed. That wasn't just for companionship. Livestock body heat was the poor man's radiator. A cow or goat snoozing in the room could bump the temperature up just enough to make a real difference. You've probably heard the phrase three-dog night, right? It comes from this exact idea. In harsh winters, the number of dogs you needed to sleep with in order to stay warm became a sort of rating system. A one-dog night? Pretty mild. A three-dog night? Bitter cold. And let's be real, medieval people would have gladly accepted a canine cuddle-puddle if it meant waking up with functioning fingers. As you lie there, listening to your companions shift under their own covers, you start to appreciate the subtle warmth coming off them, even from across the room. The air's still cold, but it's not quite the bone-deep ache it would be if you were alone. The combined body heat of 3 people in one room makes a difference, however small. It's not luxurious, it's not even comfortable, but it's survivable. And in the Middle Ages, that was enough. There's a downside though, several in fact. For one, shared beds meant shared problems. Bedbugs, fleas, lice, you name it. Once one person had an infestation, the whole group was in on the experience, not to mention the noises. Snoring, coughing, the occasional sleep-talking confession, it all happened within arm's reach. And then, of course, there were the smells. Hygiene wasn't exactly a strong point in medieval life, and even with layers of wool and linen between you, there's only so much a pile of rushes can do to mask the scent of unwashed feet and garlic breath. Yet people made do. Bedtime etiquette emerged, not formally, but through generations of trial and error. You learned not to kick, you tried to sleep facing the same direction as the person next to you, mostly to avoid face-to-face awkwardness and the smell of someone else's dinner. You didn't hog the blanket, and if you had to get up in the middle of the night, you moved quietly and quickly so you didn't disturb the whole human oven you'd carefully built. One fun side note, in some communities, people actually rented bed space. By the night, by the blanket, or even by the foot of the bed. Taverns and inns often rented out half a bed to travellers, meaning you'd be curling up with a complete stranger if you wanted to stay warm. Charming, right? Nothing like ending a long journey by spooning a merchant from 2 towns over. There's still debate among historians about how widespread and acceptable this was. Some argue it was more common in cities and market towns, where demand for lodging outstripped supply. Others suggest it was largely a lower class phenomenon, and that those with any social standing avoided it when they could. Either way, it's a powerful reminder. Warmth was a commodity, and privacy, that came second. As the night deepens, the room grows darker and quieter. The oil lamp sputters once and dies, plunging the chamber into soft blackness. You shift beneath your blanket, careful not to disturb the sleeping forms beside you. You can feel your own breath warming the air inside the folds of your bedding. Your feet brush against the coarse cloth of the mattress, but they're no longer numb. It's not that the room is warm, far from it. But the collective body heat has tipped the scales just enough. You're not shivering. You're not so stiff. You're not thinking about getting up and sleeping next to the hearth like some desperate draft dodger. In this moment, you're participating in a tradition older than the castle itself, the silent communal act of nighttime survival. A quiet strategy passed down not through books or edicts, but through necessity. You've traded luxury for warmth, space for shared breath, solitude for survival, and in the Middle Ages, that made all the difference. You close your eyes, one more night held together by wool, proximity, and sheer stubborn willpower. In the chill of the castle, human warmth is both shield and sword, and tonight, you're lucky enough to have both. You wake before dawn as usual, the room is dim, the air sharp and unmoving, and the first thing you feel is someone else's foot, icy and wedged awkwardly against your ankle. For a second you forget where you are, until your ears pick up the sound of soft breathing, straw rustling under shifting weight, and the faint creak of timber overhead. Right! Shared chamber, the group sleep strategy. Surprisingly effective, slightly claustrophobic, and, as it turns out, deeply unromantic. You wriggle out from under the blanket with the caution of someone disarming a booby trap, no sudden moves. The last thing you want to do is knock over the oil lamp, or worse, wake the other sleepers and start a morning chorus of complaints. Your feet hit the floor, and once again you're reminded that the warmth you enjoyed overnight is now dissolving into thin air. Literally. The cold has already returned, curling around your legs, slipping into your sleeves like it's got unfinished business. Still, despite the early hour and the frozen toes, you're better off than some. Because you've got something not everyone in the castle does. A proper sleeping space. It might not be private, but it's indoors under a roof within stone walls. For most people, that wasn't guaranteed. In fact, how you slept and where was determined almost entirely by your social class. Let's start at the top. Nobles and wealthy landowners got rooms, real rooms. Private chambers with doors, fireplaces, featherbeds, and, if they were lucky, thick curtains to keep out the draught. The walls might have tapestries, the floors might be covered with rugs or straw or even furs. If anyone in the castle had a shot at sleeping comfortably in the dead of winter, it was them. But even then, comfort was relative. Unless you were sleeping right next to the fire, the air was cold, you were still bundling in layers, using warming pans and hoping your dog didn't steal all the heat by curling up too aggressively at your feet. Now contrast that with the lower classes, the peasants, stable hands, scullery maids, grooms and page boys. These folks often slept wherever there was space, in the lofts above kitchens and storerooms, in hallways, or even right next to the livestock. A family in a small cottage might all sleep in one room, parents, kids, grandparents, and a few chickens. And if you lived and worked in a castle, you were probably crashing near your station. Cooks slept by the kitchen hearth, grooms curled up in the stables. The most loyal or most unlucky servants might sleep at the foot of their lord's bed, curled on a mat or even just layered in cloaks on the floor. And that brings us to the real divide. Who slept warmer? Because here's the twist. Sometimes it wasn't the noble with the fancy bed who had the warmest sleep. Sometimes it was the peasant family packed into a low, smoky, mud-walled hut, sharing body heat, huddled with their animals, and warmed by a central hearth that never fully went out. Castle life looked glamorous from a distance, but those massive stone rooms were cold and drafty. The higher the ceiling, the colder the night. Peasant homes, especially in colder regions, were built for heat retention, not beauty. Thatched roofs, low beams, packed-to earth floors, and tightly sealed windows meant they were less picturesque but more practical. Sure, you'd still freeze if the fire went out, but at least you weren't sleeping under a vaulted ceiling with a window slit aimed directly at your spleen. You sneak into the corridor now, moving quietly as your boots echo on the stone floor. Outside your chamber, the castle is hushed, wrapped in its own version of sleep. The occasional torch flickers on the wall, and the air smells faintly of smoke and last night's mutton stew. You pass by a small servant's alcove. No bed, just a heap of cloaks and what looks like a half-folded wool curtain. Someone's curled up there, snoring softly. No mattress, no privacy, no heat source, just grit and layers. This is what sleeping arrangements looked like for most of the castle's population. If you were a servant, especially one without high status, you slept where you worked. No room of your own, no fire, unless you were close to a hearth, and definitely no featherbed. Maybe you had a straw tick, if your employer was generous. More likely you had a folded cloak and some animal skins. You learned to sleep curled up, knees to chest, breath tucked into your scarf to warm your own face. Yet even in these lower tiers, people got clever. You start to notice it everywhere. Servants stuffing old rags into wall cracks, wrapping their feet in spare linen, or hanging damp cloaks near the fire to dry and warm them for the night. You hear about families who heated stones in the fire and wrapped them in cloth to take to bed, or who used children as little space heaters, tucking the youngest in the middle of the pile so they'd stay warm. Rough, yes, but also kind of ingenious. Here's a quirky little detail. In some areas, children would sleep in drawers. Not furniture drawers, though that's a fun image, but box-like wooden cradles or built-in wall cubbies, essentially little shelves made for sleeping. These spaces were often partially enclosed and retained warmth far better than open beds. In parts of rural Europe, these bed boxes, sometimes called alcove beds or cupboard beds, stuck around for centuries, especially in cold climates like the Netherlands and Scandinavia. Tiny sleeping pods? The medieval world invented them long before capsule hotels were trendy. You step into a small side room off the kitchen. It's warmer here, even before the fire's been relit, because the stone has soaked up heat from yesterday's baking. You can see where the kitchen staff sleep, a pile of cloaks near the hearth, one worn mattress shoved against the wall, and a few wooden chests that double as both storage and impromptu bedding. A cat stretches and yawns on top of one, clearly having claimed the warmest spot in the room. Smart beast. There's one fire that still smoulders in the hearth, a pile of ash shielding a few glowing embers. It's a reminder that even for those who slept near heat, nothing was guaranteed. The fire still needed to be tended, and in the medieval world, heat didn't stick around long. It faded. Fast. If you were lucky, the person on fire duty remembered to bank the coals. If not, you woke up to frozen water jugs and stiff joints. Some scholars argue that the lack of distinct sleeping rooms for most people led to tighter family bonds, or at least stronger teamwork. Everyone worked together to stay warm, survive illness, and navigate the long dark nights of winter. Others suggest it was deeply unpleasant. No privacy, no rest, and a constant war with fleas, dampness, and cold. Either way, the lines between public and private, work and rest, were much blurrier than they are today. As you lean against the warmest part of the kitchen wall, you start to realize that sleeping arrangements weren't just about comfort. They were about survival. Every piece of fabric, every shared bed, every animal brought indoors at night was a tiny rebellion against the cold. 1,000 small adaptations made by people who didn't have a choice, who couldn't just turn a knob on a thermostat or buy a heated blanket. You take one last look at the makeshift beds and step back into the hall, breath visible once again, the stone under your boots cold as ever. One night in the Lord's chamber, one night in the group bed, and now this glimpse into the servant quarters. It's clear now, sleeping in a medieval castle wasn't just about who had the nicest bed. It was about knowing how to trap heat, share space, and endure with whatever scraps of warmth you could find. And if that meant tucking yourself into a pile of cloaks next to the bread oven, so be it. By now you've become something of a seasoned traveller in the cold corridors of the castle. You know how to recognise the warm zones from the wind tunnels, how to spot a bed that's more than just a sack of straw, and, maybe most importantly, how to avoid the draftiest corners when it's time to sleep. But tonight, you're not exploring some dim hallway or tucking yourself into a peasant's alcove. Tonight, you're sleeping in a room designed to keep the cold out, or at least pretend to. It's a chamber lined with centuries-old ingenuity, subtle tricks woven into stone, timber, and cloth, all working together to wage a slow, stubborn war against the medieval chill. You enter the room just before nightfall, carrying a candle that flutters slightly with every step. The door is thick, solid oak reinforced with iron bands, and it shuts with a heavy, reassuring thud. Right away you notice the difference. The air inside doesn't bite at your skin like it does in the stairwells or open halls. It's not warm exactly, but it's noticeably less hostile. There's a quiet stillness here, a trapped warmth, like the room has remembered what heat feels like. The walls are draped with thick tapestries, each one a masterpiece of medieval craft, but more importantly, each one a buffer. These weren't hung just to impress guests. Wall hangings helped block the flow of cold air that seeped through stone walls like invisible fog. Behind every tapestry is an insulating pocket of air, a trick that might seem simple now, but back then was a revelation. The thicker the fabric, the more warmth it could hold back. Wool was common, sometimes lined with linen or even fur, and while it didn't turn the room into a sauna, it made survival far more likely. The windows, small, narrow, and set deep into the wall, are covered not just with wooden shutters, but with layered fabric, like makeshift curtains. Glass windows, while not unheard of by the late Middle Ages, were still rare and costly, and even if you had one, it was probably a wavy leaded affair that didn't do much for insulation. What mattered was the shutter. Solid wood, tightly fitted, and usually latched shut at sundown. Some folks went a step further, sealing gaps with waxed cloth, straw, or even clay in the dead of winter. Anything to block the icy breath of the night from whispering through the cracks. The floor beneath your feet isn't bare stone, bless whoever made that decision. Instead, thick rushes cover the ground, mixed with dried herbs like lavender, mint, and chamomile. They're not just for scent, although the effect is surprisingly pleasant. The rushes act as insulation, a barrier between your feet and the freezing stone. Over time, layers of dried material would compress into a dense mat, surprisingly effective at holding warmth. In grander rooms like this one, you might even find woven rugs or animal skins layered on top, deer hides maybe, or thick sheepskin. You walk further into the room and spot the fireplace, small, simple, but active. A modest fire crackles within a stone hearth built into the outer wall. Above it, a narrow flue carries the smoke upward, hopefully not into your face. This is one of the great architectural advances of later medieval castles, the individual room fireplace. Early castles relied heavily on central fires in the great hall or kitchens, but over time private chambers were upgraded. Not every room had one, only the higher-ranking folks, but the effect was dramatic. Even a small fire, properly managed, could raise the temperature by several degrees, enough to stop your teeth from chattering, enough to fall asleep without wrapping your face in linen like a mummy. Now, the fire alone wasn't enough. Everyone knew that. That's why rooms like this were built with other subtle warmth-saving features. You might notice that the ceiling is low, not to make you claustrophobic, but to keep warm air from rising too far above your head. You might also notice the bed is pushed against an inner wall, one that doesn't face the outside. Interior walls absorbed heat better and lost it slower. The closer you were to the core of the building, the more warmth you could trap, like huddling around the heart of a beast. Even the placement of the room matters. This chamber sits above the kitchen, and you can still feel the faint heat rising up through the floorboards, carried on invisible plumes of cooked air and old smoke. Strategic room placement wasn't just about convenience, it was about survival. Sleeping above the bakery, the kitchen, or the buttery was a smart move. These areas stayed warm longer due to their constant activity. The floors above them reaped the benefits. Now here's a fun, slightly fringe fact. In some castles there were even internal corridors that acted as wind buffers between the outside world and important rooms. Think of them like medieval mudrooms, or airlocks. You didn't just walk straight into a sleeping chamber from the freezing courtyard. You went through a series of doors and halls, each one trapping just a bit more warmth, keeping the sleeping quarters from becoming snow globes. Some scholars argue that architecture in the Middle Ages wasn't as crude as we often assume. Sure, they didn't have insulation foam or thermal windows, but they understood airflow. They understood stone's tendency to absorb cold, and they learned how to combat it, not with technology, but with clever design. Others disagree, suggesting that most warming strategies were reactive, not planned, and that most warmth-saving features were afterthoughts, not blueprints. The debate continues, but the truth probably lies somewhere in between. Necessity bred invention, and the smartest households picked up those tricks fast. You settle near the fire, warming your hands and watching the light flicker across the room. The temperature's still nowhere near comfortable, but you're not freezing. That alone feels like a miracle. You take in the room, the tapestries, the layered bedding, the draft-stopping curtains, and you start to understand how people lived like this. Not in luxury, not in comfort, but with knowledge, practice, and careful attention to detail. They didn't wait for the chill to win. They fought it with every scrap of fabric, every warm stone, every perfectly placed room above a kitchen hearth. This was more than home decor, it was strategy. And tonight you sleep in the results of that strategy, not exactly warm, but warm enough. You're sitting by the fire again, close enough to feel the occasional sting of a flying ember. But not so close that your clothes catch, because that actually happened more often than you'd like to think. Fires were essential, but they were also unpredictable little monsters. You had to respect them, especially when they were your only heat source during the longest, coldest nights of the year. But this fire isn't just for ambient warmth tonight. You're here for something very specific, something small, ancient, and absolutely crucial in a world without radiators or electric blankets. Your secret nighttime weapon. You reach for the warming pan hanging from a hook near the hearth. It's a round, shallow metal container with a long wooden handle and a hinged lid. You open it carefully and begin to fill it with glowing coals from the fire. Not too many. You're trying to preheat your bed, not recreate a Viking funeral. Once the coals are settled, you close the lid, and a faint trail of smoke curls through the tiny holes punched in the top. You hold it by the handle, careful not to let the heat travel up into your hand, and carry it toward your sleeping chamber. This little tool was one of the most ingenious bedtime hacks of the medieval world. Warming pans were the unsung heroes of the winter months. You didn't sleep with them, obviously, unless you had a death wish, but you did use them to preheat your bedding before climbing in. You'd slide the pan back and forth under the covers, letting the hot metal radiate through the sheets and blankets, warming them just enough to take the edge off. Then just before getting in, you'd remove it. Simple, elegant, and effective. If you didn't forget it in the bed and roll over onto a smouldering disc of metal, that is. But warming pans weren't the only trick in the medieval sleep toolkit. You set the pan aside on the stone floor now, its job done, and reach for something else, an old wool sock filled with stones. You slide the sock close to the embers, rotating it occasionally to warm the stones inside. Another humble invention. Heated stones, wrapped in cloth or tucked into bags, were placed under blankets at the foot of the bed, right near your frozen toes. And once they were warm enough, they held on to heat for surprisingly long. You could also heat bricks, though they were heavier and required a little more care not to scorch the sheets. Some even used dried beans or cherry pits sewn into linen pouches and warmed by the fire, a surprisingly modern touch for a time known for leeches and plague. You carry the warmed stone bundle to your bed and slide it beneath the covers, where it sinks into the straw mattress with a soft thud. Instantly, the air around it begins to warm. It's not magic, but it feels close. In a world where surviving the night wasn't guaranteed, these simple tools were acts of resistance. They turned freezing beds into barely tolerable sanctuaries night after night, and for those without warming pans or hot stones, they got creative or desperate. One fringe method, filling bottles with hot water and wrapping the material in cloth. And no, these weren't like your cozy rubber hot water bottle from Grandma's closet. We're talking about actual glass or ceramic bottles and the occasional repurposed wineskin. As you can imagine, these had a short lifespan, especially when someone dropped one into the bed and it cracked open under a pile of wool and body weight. It worked until it didn't. Another, slightly more dangerous option? Charcoal braziers. These were small metal containers filled with smouldering coals set inside a room, usually in a corner or near the centre, and allowed to burn slowly through the night. But charcoal, as it turns out, produces carbon monoxide. And in poorly ventilated rooms, which, spoiler alert, most medieval bedrooms were, this could be deadly. There are historical accounts of entire families being found dead by morning, victims of their own attempts at warmth. A tragic irony, trying not to freeze to death, and accidentally dying of invisible poison gas instead. You check the pan one more time, making sure the coals inside have dimmed and cooled. It's safer to keep it near the door now, just in case someone gets clumsy in the dark. Fire safety in the Middle Ages was less a set of regulations and more a collection of oral horror stories. Don't fall asleep with your blanket too close to the hearth, or you'll end up like Uncle Godwin. In fact, many households had strict nighttime routines for fire care. Coals were banked under ash to preserve them until morning. Fires were surrounded by stones to prevent rollouts, and rooms with no chimneys were aired out for hours to let smoke clear before sleeping. There's a debate among historians about how widespread these nighttime tools really were. Some believe warming pans and heated stones were common only among wealthier households, because after all you needed a fire to heat the tools in the first place. Others argue that even peasants, with their limited means, adapted versions of these methods using whatever materials they had. Clay pots, heated stones from outdoor fire pits, and even fire-baked bricks from bread ovens all made appearances in the makeshift heating repertoire. It probably depended on geography, status, and the particular kind of desperation winter inspired. But there's no debate about one thing. People didn't just lie down and hope for the best. They prepared for the cold like it was a battle. Every night was a tactical exercise. Position the bed right, warm the sheets, layer the blankets, block the drafts, share body heat, breathe slowly, stay still, conserve warmth. Surviving until morning wasn't just a matter of habit, it was a skill. You settle into your bed now, the stone under your feet still radiating a soft, fading warmth. The fabric of the sheets has absorbed just enough heat from the pan to take away the sting. The blanket above you feels heavier than usual, but it's comforting. Even your pillow is a little less frigid than before. You lie there, surrounded by layers of wool, fur, and ingenuity, and let your body slowly sink into sleep. Somewhere outside, the wind howls through the battlements, testing the windows and moaning down the chimneys. The fire in the hearth has gone quiet. Just a glow now, flickering behind the grate like a watchful eye. Your breath fogs in the darkness of the bedroom curtains, but you're not trembling. Not tonight. Not after your careful little rituals, your ancient tools, your stone-warmed socks and fire-smart tactics. You smile faintly, knowing that you've joined the ranks of millions who came before you, people who faced down winter without modern comforts, armed only with what they could heat, carry or borrow. You close your eyes, nestled in the warmest bed this castle has ever offered you, and let the cold keep knocking at the door. Is not getting in tonight. Sleep doesn't come easy in a place like this, not because of nightmares or noisy neighbours, but because your bladder doesn't care how many woolen layers you're wrapped in or how long it took you to build your perfect little nest of warmth. Nature calls, rudely, and in the Middle Ages, answering that call in the dead of night could be a mini-quest in itself. You shift under the covers, weighing your options. On one hand, you could ignore it and pray it goes away. On the other, you could face what's waiting just outside the bed. Icy air, stone floors, and a chamber pot that might already be half frozen. Reluctantly, you sit up, pulling the heavy blankets off as slowly as possible, trying not to disturb the fragile bubble of heat you've spent all night nurturing. The air hits your skin like a slap. Not gentle, not polite, just cold, aggressive, and immediate. You swing your feet over the side of the bed and press them into the rush-covered floor, which is about as warm and welcoming as a pond in January. You fumble for your cloak, draping it around your shoulders, and shuffle toward the corner of the room where salvation, or something close to it, awaits, the chamber pot. Ah yes, the medieval bathroom experience. A ceramic, wooden, or metal vessel tucked discreetly under the bed or behind a curtain. It's not glamorous, but it's practical. No one in their right mind would wander across a stone keep in the middle of a winter night just to find a guardrobe. Those were cold, drafty, and occasionally terrifying, perched over pits or chutes, sometimes open to the outside air. On a good day, they smelled like centuries of regret. On a bad one, the seat was covered in frost. So no, most people did not go running to the castle latrine at midnight. They used the pot. You kneel down, remove the lid, and try not to breathe too deeply. The air near it is predictably awful. The cold may have slowed down the smell, but it didn't eliminate it. Still, it's better than losing a toe just to relieve yourself. After you're finished, you cover the pot again, scooting it back into its hiding place. Some pots had lids that could seal tight. Others just relied on hope and a strategic placement far from the bed. It's gross, sure, but everyone did it. Nobles, servants, children. Some even had their chamber pots emptied by someone else, which sounds like the height of luxury, till you realise that someone else probably hated your guts. And here's a fun, if disgusting, fringe fact. Some folks skip the pot entirely and use pea stones. Flat rocks, often kept near the fire, that could be warmed and urinated on directly. It evaporated faster in the heat and didn't require emptying a vessel in the morning. Not exactly hygienic, but when it's 2 a.m. and your room is basically an icebox, convenience wins. Still, for all their usefulness, chamber pots weren't ideal. Come morning, they had to be emptied, usually by a servant and usually out of a window. That's not just a cliché. Garde à l'eau wasn't shouted for fun, it was a warning. In cities and towns, people tossed the contents of chamber pots into the streets, ideally during set hours. In castles, it depended. If you were lucky, your waste went into a proper chute or latrine shaft. If not, you or your servant carried it out by hand, trying not to spill anything on the way down 5 flights of spiral stairs. You crawl back into bed, trying not to think too hard about what you just did, or smelled. The sheets are cold again, of course. Your little nest of warmth has been compromised. It always amazes you how fast the cold returns. It's like it was waiting for you, curled in the corner, biding its time. You pull the blankets over your head. Clutch the stone bundle you warmed earlier, and try to return to sleep, but something nags at you. Not fear, not discomfort, just the simple realization that everyone in this castle, high and low, is dealing with the same situation. Everyone has to wake up to relieve themselves. Everyone faces the same cold floors, the same awful smell, the same moment of hesitation before climbing back into freezing sheets. It's one of the few truly universal medieval experiences. No one escapes the night. There's some debate among historians about how widespread chamber pots actually were. Some argue that only the upper classes had dedicated pots in their rooms, while poorer folks made do with shared privies or less formal arrangements. Others suggest that even the most modest households had some kind of nighttime container, even if it was just a bucket or a cracked bowl. What we do know is that by the later Middle Ages, chamber pots had become common enough to appear in wills, inventories and court records. Some were basic clay, others were elaborately decorated, even made of pewter or silver. Because if you're going to urinate indoors, why not do it with style? But the real divide wasn't in who had a pot, it was in who had to empty it. That duty usually fell to the lowest ranked servants. And it wasn't just a matter of dumping it once. Some households had chamber pots in multiple rooms, especially during feasts or cold months, when guests didn't want to wander the halls at night. Servants had to make morning rounds, collect the pots, clean them, and return them before breakfast. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary, and the castle didn't run without it. You sigh and burrow deeper under the covers. Your feet finally start to warm again, thanks to the stone still tucked near the end of the bed. You think about the servant who'll come in tomorrow morning to stoke the fire, sweep out the rushes, and collect the pot. You hope they're dressed in layers. You hope they didn't sleep on the floor. And maybe you feel just a little more connected to them, even from your slightly nicer bed with its wool blanket and canopy curtain. Because in the end, it doesn't matter how thick your tapestries are, how many fires you've got burning, or how many furs you sleep beneath. Sooner or later, you still have to get up in the middle of the night, stumble across the cold floor, and do what needs doing. The cold makes equals of us all. Your eyes open again sometime before dawn, not because you're uncomfortable, though yes, your toes have betrayed you and turned back into ice cubes, but because you've reached the end of your first sleep. It's a strange thing, waking up in the middle of the night and not being alarmed. There's no groggy panic, no reaching for a glowing rectangle to check the time. You just lie there, awake, a little cold, a little bored, and somehow that's completely normal, because in the Middle Ages, the idea of one long, uninterrupted night of sleep wasn't the standard. In fact, people didn't expect it. They planned for a 2-part night, what historians now refer to as segmented sleep. First sleep, then a quiet, wakeful period followed by second sleep. It sounds bizarre to our modern 8-hour monoculture ears, but to medieval minds it was just how the body worked. You fell asleep shortly after dark, slept for a few hours, woke naturally around midnight, and stayed up for an hour or two before drifting off again until morning. You lie there now in your wool-cocooned bed, your breath puffing faintly in the cold air under the canopy, and realise you've joined a centuries-old tradition. The first sleep is done. Now it's time for the mysterious twilight middle of the night, the hush between worlds where the castle is quiet, the hearth embers are low, and time feels suspended. During this wakeful period, medieval folks didn't just stare at the ceiling. They used the time. Some said prayers or meditated. Others read, if they were literate and rich enough to own books. Couples sometimes used the time for talking or for intimacy, snuggled together under layers of blankets, grateful for the small warmth that another body could offer. And yes, some people just got up, stirred the fire, maybe checked on the animals, and then returned to bed. No rush, no guilt, just a pause. You think about lighting a candle, but decide against it. Instead, you just listen. Outside the room, the castle is hushed in that particular way old stone buildings are. Quiet, but never silent. You hear the wind squeezing through a crack in the shutter. A distant snore, muffled by walls. Somewhere lower down, a kitchen servant might already be awake, starting a fire for morning bread. The castle breathes, in its own slow, ancient rhythm. This middle-of-the-night interlude wasn't just about practical tasks, It was also deeply cultural. In some regions, people even used the term first sleep and second sleep casually, as if they were official parts of the day. There are records of conversations, letters, and medical texts that reference this segmented rest like it was common knowledge, because it was. Doctors in the Middle Ages even recommended it. They believed the hour or two of quiet wakefulness was good for digestion, mental clarity, and emotional balance. Who needs therapy when you've got midnight pacing in a drafty hall? There's a scholarly debate about whether segmented sleep was a natural human rhythm or something born out of necessity. After all, without artificial light, most people's days were governed by the sun. Long winter nights could last 14 hours or more. That's a lot of darkness to just sleep through. So maybe the brain adjusted, slipping into a biphasic rhythm to cope. On the other hand, there are those who argue that this pattern was socially encouraged, even ritualized. It wasn't just biology, it was tradition, routine, culture wrapped in wool. You curl onto your side, the cold side of the pillow waking your cheek, and start to drift again. Not quite back into sleep, but not fully awake either. The world in this in-between time feels soft and blurred, like candlelight flickering behind a curtain. It's easy to see how myths and dreams could slip into each other here. People told stories during this time, shared whispered tales in the dark, prayed, worried, hoped. The boundaries between night and day, dream and thought, were thinner then. In fact, some people kept a night book, a kind of journal where they wrote down dreams or revelations from this midnight window. There was a sense that the world was more open, more magical in this liminal space. And whether you were a monk in a stone abbey or a farmer in a smoke-darkened cottage, that quiet hour between sleeps belonged to you. Still, practicality often ruled, fires had to be tended. In the castle, someone was always on watch. A servant might use this time to warm the coals, check the blankets, or empty chamber pots before the rest of the household woke. The wealthy might sip hot wine or broth to coax themselves into the second sleep. Recipes from the period include warm milk with herbs, spiced ale or honey water, all designed to settle the body and mind and keep the cold at bay for another few hours. You sit up slowly, careful not to let the covers fall too far down, and reach for the little cloth-wrapped stone at your feet. It's still faintly warm, not hot, but enough to nudge your toes back from the brink. You tuck it close to your belly under the outermost blanket and breathe deeply. If you were living in a peasant's cottage, you might be using your last embers to warm this stone. If you were a monk, you'd be kneeling on freezing flagstones right now, chanting matins. If you were a noblewoman, perhaps you'd be sitting by the fire with a bit of embroidery or reviewing your prayers with a maid by candlelight. Instead, you're here, halfway between awake and asleep, the fire low, the castle still. You realise slowly that second sleep is calling, not with the blunt force of exhaustion, but with the soft tug of comfort returning. Your body has done this before, it knows the path back. You lie down again, this time pulling the covers a little tighter, adjusting the stone into the crook of your knees. You know it won't be warm much longer, but it doesn't have to be. The second sleep doesn't require comfort, just stillness, just quiet. You let your thoughts wander, not worrying where they go. The wind presses against the shutter like a persistent child, but the latch holds. You're safe inside, cocooned, at peace despite the chill. And then, without any real transition, you're gone. Second sleep has taken you. In the morning, you'll wake to firewood being carried in, the scrape of boots on stone, the smell of baking bread. But for now, you rest in the dark, wrapped in the strange rhythm of medieval sleep. 2 parts, 1 soul, and just enough warmth to get you through the coldest part of the night. The fire's long gone cold by the time you wake, but you don't notice at first. The warmth still trapped inside your bedding has lingered, clinging to the linen and wool like a shy houseguest who hasn't realised the party's over. Outside the canopy curtain, the room is quiet. The kind of quiet that means everyone else is still sleeping or too cold to start moving yet. You blink in the semi-darkness, your breath puffing gently against the heavy fabric above your head, and think, not for the first time, how lucky you are to have a bed at all. Not just any bed either, a real one. Wooden frame, carved post, stuffed mattress, curtains, and maybe even your own bolster pillow if the household's not feeling stingy. Beds weren't just places to sleep in the Middle Ages, they were status symbols, the medieval equivalent of a luxury car parked outside your house. If you had a bed with heavy fabric, carvings, a feather mattress, and maybe even a personal servant to warm it with a pan of coals before you climbed in, Congratulations, you were living large. You pull the curtain aside and peek into the room. The air outside your woolen cocoon hits you instantly, sharp, damp and mean. The hearth is a grey bowl of ash, no flicker, no warmth, just the ghost of last night's fire. But what catches your eye isn't the cold, it's the bed. The entire contraption, from the thick post to the pile of blankets, suddenly feels like more than a place to sleep. It's a fortress, a throne, an invention. Medieval beds were more than furniture. They were tactical responses to an environment that had no interest in your comfort. Stone castles were cold, loud, drafty, and not built with snoozing in mind. So when someone got a bed, they didn't just toss together a few planks and call it a night. They engineered it. Raised platforms kept sleepers off the icy floor. Canopies and curtains trapped body heat. Mattresses were layered, first a straw tick to insulate from below, or then featherbeds or wool-stuffed bolsters for softness, topped with sheets and every blanket available. This wasn't indulgence, it was defence. You stand now pulling a heavy woolen robe over your linen night shift and inspecting the bed more closely. The posts are thick oak, carved with little flourishes, nothing extravagant, but more than a purely functional piece. The canopy above is solid wood as well, with crossbeams supporting the draped curtains. You think about how heavy all this must be. In some places, beds were so large and elaborate they had to be built inside the room, assembled piece by piece like flat-pack furniture centuries before that was a thing. You didn't move your bed from room to room. You moved into the bed's room, permanently. And here's the fascinating part. Some of these beds weren't just for sleeping, they were for being seen. If you were a noble or landed gentry, your bed was a stage. You might receive guests in it, fully dressed, but reclined among pillows. You'd conduct business, hold court, or entertain visitors from your bed, as though it were a very large, very expensive chair with a mattress. Some people even died in them ceremonially, surrounded by family and clergy, as though the bed itself were part of the rite. It was more than furniture. It was identity. And it was portable, at least in theory. Wealthy nobles on the move didn't trust strange beds in stranger castles. They brought their own. A travelling bed included a collapsible wooden frame, mattress rolls, bedclothes and curtains, all transported in carts along with everything else. Think medieval glamping, except instead of LED string lights and a tent, you've got a four-poster bed with velvet trim being hauled up a muddy road. You sit on the edge of the mattress and run your hand across the bedding. The outermost layer is a coverlet, likely made of wool or embroidered linen, maybe even quilted if the household could afford it. Beneath that, a heavy wool blanket, dark and plain, then linen sheets, coarse but clean. Further down is the mattress itself, lumpy in places, but still superior to sleeping on rushes. It's probably stuffed with wool or straw. Featherbeds existed, sure, but not for most people. They were expensive, difficult to clean, and required a lot of maintenance. Straw, on the other hand, was abundant and replaceable. You just had to deal with the occasional rustling and the chance of sharing your bed with a beetle or two. One quirky feature you notice: a bed key. Not a literal key, but a tool used to tighten the ropes beneath the mattress. That's right, sleep tight wasn't just a sweet little phrase. Beds were built with a grid of ropes crisscrossing the frame supporting the mattress. Over time those ropes sagged. You'd use a wooden peg, the bed key, to twist them tight again, restoring firmness to the bed. No ropes, no support, and you were rolling into the middle like a sleepy sandwich filling. Now, the debate. Were these beds truly comfortable? Some scholars think we romanticize them too much, pointing to the basic materials, the lack of springs, and the constant need for maintenance. Others argue that given the alternatives, bare floor, straw pile, or sharing a stable with a goat, these beds were marvels of comfort for their time. The truth is likely in the middle. If you had the money and the means, you could sleep in something shockingly comfortable by medieval standards. If you didn't, in Dichten, you may do, and thank the saints if the straw wasn't mouldy. You walk over to the tapestry-draped wall, warming your hands near the spot where yesterday's fire heated the stone. The sun has begun to filter through the curtain, casting a soft grey light into the room. Soon the rest of the household will stir. Fires will be lit, pots scrubbed, floors swept. The castle will come alive again. But for now, in this moment of quiet, you stand beside a bed that's more than just a place to rest. It's a symbol of adaptation, wealth, survival, and a little bit of luxury carved out of a harsh, freezing world. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you realise something else. In a castle that's all stone and cold and wind, the bed is the warmest room in the house. Not a room with 4 walls, mind you, but 4 posts, 3 blankets and 1 very smart curtain. The sun has barely climbed above the horizon when you hear it. A soft scuffle outside your chamber door, followed by a quiet snort and the unmistakable shuffle of claws on stone. You pull the curtain aside and poke your head out into the chill air, which smacks you with its usual medieval morning rudeness. Sure enough, right outside your door, curled up like a furry bread loaf, is a dog, big shaggy and absolutely unapologetic about drooling on the rushes. When it hears you, it lifts its head, tail thumping once, then drops it again like, "Go back to bed, idiot, it's still freezing." And you know what? The dog's got a point. You crawl back under the covers for a moment, because now your mind is busy thinking about all the creatures who shared medieval sleeping spaces, not just the humans. You might imagine castles as pristine places full of gleaming armour and well-dressed nobles, but in reality, they were often just glorified barns with better window views. Animals weren't always kept separate. In fact, they were sometimes your best shot at staying warm. You pull the blanket up to your chin and consider this: in a world without electric heaters, thermal socks, or even reliable indoor fires, body heat was your most renewable resource. And while humans generated a decent amount, you know what produced even more, consistently and without complaint? Animals. Furry, breathing, heat-radiating animals. Let's start with dogs. They weren't just guards or hunting companions, they were medieval hot water bottles with tails. People let them into bed, curled up with them under blankets, and some households even bred dogs specifically to serve as lap warmers during cold nights. In castles, especially in private chambers, dogs would sleep at their owner's feet or on top of the bedding. If you had a small well-fed lapdog, great. Congrats on your living foot warmer. But even if your mutt was larger and more inclined to smell like yesterday's stew, it was still better than sleeping alone in the cold. You hear the dog outside the door rustle again and chuckle to yourself. You can already feel the floor vibrating a little, which means the hound has gotten up and is now scratching its ear with enough force to knock dust off the rafters. Classic. But the dog's presence here is comforting. It's not just about heat. There's something reassuring about knowing someone, or something, is nearby, awake, and radiating warmth into the air. How dogs weren't the only sleep buddies of the medieval world. Cats were welcome too, not just because they killed vermin, though that was a huge perk, but because they were excellent at finding and hoarding warm spots. If you had a cat in the house, it would gravitate toward the warmest part of the bed, curl up in the crook of your knees, and stay there until morning. You didn't train the cat to do this, it just knew. In rural homes and some less formal castle quarters, it wasn't unusual for livestock to be kept close to the living quarters, or in some cases, in the same room. Chickens in the corner, goats near the hearth, and if you were really ambitious, maybe even a pig. It wasn't about laziness or a lack of boundaries, it was practical. Animals gave off heat. They blocked drafts and, if you were lucky, they didn't poop on the floor while you slept. There's an old saying, a cow in the room keeps the frost from the bed. Okay, maybe no one actually said that out loud, but they might as well have. In harsh climates and poorer homes, cattle sheds and human dwellings were often connected, sometimes sharing a wall. In the case of longhouses or crofter cottages, the division between livestock and family might be little more than a half-height wooden partition, or nothing at all. It smelled, sure, but it was warmer. Of course, this blending of humans and animals wasn't always tidy. Fleas, lice, mites, they didn't discriminate between nobleman, servant, or sheep. You might fall asleep with a cat purring on your chest and wake up scratching like you've been rolling in nettles. That's the trade-off. Warmth came with guests, and not always the welcome kind. Still, many saw animals as part of the household in more than just a functional sense. They were companions, comfort, sometimes even a bedmates. There are historical accounts of knights travelling with their dogs and sleeping with them on the road, pressed together under furs on the ground. Monks in frigid monasteries sometimes kept cats for warmth, as well as pest control. Even children's lullabies made mention of sleeping next to animals, not as fantasy, but as normal life. You rise again, finally, stepping over to the door and opening it just enough to let the dog nose its way inside. It pads in like it owns the place and immediately circles 3 times before flopping onto the rushes beside your bed, letting out a sigh that says, "Finally, some decency." You smile and drop a hand to scratch behind its ears. Its fur is thick and slightly damp, but the heat coming off its body is undeniable, as you give it 50 minutes and the entire room will be a degree or two warmer. And that matters, because even a slight bump in temperature can mean the difference between deep sleep and a night of restless shivering. That's something medieval people understood intuitively. They couldn't explain convection currents or calculate BTUs, but they knew how to survive. They layered, they shared, and when all else failed, they invited the dog into the bed and made peace with the smell. There's a fringe theory some scholars have floated, that medieval people weren't just tolerating animals in their beds, but deliberately structuring their sleeping arrangements around them. Placing dogs or cats strategically, warming up the foot of the bed with their bodies, even keeping hay or sheepskin under the blankets to trap heat more effectively when animals couldn't be found. It wasn't science, it was instinct born from centuries of winter. Others argue this view romanticizes poverty and survival tactics, that animals in bed were a necessity, not a preference, and that the discomfort and sanitation risks far outweighed the benefits. Probably true in many cases, but that doesn't make the warmth any less real when the night is bitter and the fire's gone out. You sit back on your bed, robe wrapped tightly around your shoulders, and watch the dog settle into a contented loaf at your feet. There's something deeply comforting about the shared presence. Two creatures facing the cold together, not saying a word, just existing in mutual warmth. No electric blankets, no thermostats, no plug-in heaters humming in the background. Just a stone room, a wool blanket, and a dog. Sometimes that was enough. Evening again, the fire is lit, the shutters are closed, and the dog, ever loyal, ever flatulent, is already sprawled near the hearth, belly up, living its best medieval life. You're seated nearby, cradling a wooden cup in your hands, warm and steaming, and for once, you don't feel like a human popsicle. The reason? Tonight, you've joined the long, delicious tradition of warming from the inside out. Drinking for warmth wasn't just comfort, it was practically medicine. In the Middle Ages, when science was more about balancing imaginary bodily fluids than understanding thermodynamics, people believed cold entered the body like a creeping sickness. And while their understanding of biology might have been creative, they weren't wrong about one thing. A hot drink can make the difference between shivering in misery and curling up for a halfway decent night's sleep. You take a slow sip of the drink in your cup, thick, dark and spicy. It's a mulled ale, the kind someone might serve in a castle after supper. The base is a hearty ale, brewed strong and full of body, and it's been heated slowly over the hearth with cloves, nutmeg, a hint of cinnamon, and whatever fruit peels the kitchen had lying around. The result is warm, slightly sweet and oddly comforting. Not quite soup, not quite wine, just cosy. Alcohol played a big role in medieval night routines, not in the binge and regret way we think of today, but as a practical tool. Cold water was often unsafe to drink, and herbal infusions were time-consuming to prepare. Wine and ale, both considered safer and blessed by the gods of fermentation, were the default beverages. Heat those up, add spices or honey, and suddenly you had something that soothed the stomach, warmed the blood, and frankly helped you sleep. A triple threat. You take another sip, feeling it bloom in your chest, chasing away the chill that's been sitting between your shoulder blades all day. In wealthier households, this was a nightly ritual. A servant might bring warm-spiced wine to the Lord's chamber. In monasteries, herbal teas brewed from sage, thyme, sword or chamomile were offered to monks before matins. Even common folk had their versions, hot cider, ale boiled with herbs, or mead thinned and warmed on the stove. And if you're wondering whether the warming effect was more psychological than physical, you're not alone. Scholars still debate how much warmth a small mug of heated drink could actually provide. Some argue it was minimal, just enough to trick your nerves into thinking you weren't freezing. Others believe it made a real difference, especially when combined with food, furs and a good fire. Either way, it was a comfort, and comfort in winter is survival with better PR. Tonight, your drink pairs with a small plate of food, a crust of dark bread, a smear of soft cheese, maybe a bit of fruit that somehow hasn't rotted in the cellar. The idea of eating before bed might horrify your modern doctor, but in the Middle Ages, it was considered wise, especially in winter. You needed calories to generate heat. You needed fat to cushion your insides against the cold, and you needed something warm in your belly before crawling into a frozen bed and hoping your stone-warmed sock didn't go cold before you did. There's even an odd little fringe fact tucked in here. Some believe that too much heat inside the body could cause spiritual distraction, or worse, improper dreams. So bedtime drinks had to strike a balance. warm enough to soothe, mild enough not to stir the imagination into sin. Some medieval medical texts recommended warm milk with herbs like lettuce or poppy to promote cool, moist sleep, because clearly nothing says restful slumber like dairy and medieval psychology. You turn toward the fire again and watch the shadows flicker. The dog grunts, readjusts, and starts softly snoring like a sawmill. You're full, warm, and slightly buzzed. But not too buzzed. Another clever trick of the medieval night. Alcohol in small quantities, just enough to lull the senses. Drunkenness was frowned upon, especially in religious households, but the light tipsiness of a heated drink, perfectly acceptable. Encouraged even, if it meant you slept through the worst of the cold. Some households took it even further, adding medicinal herbs to their drinks to treat coughs, headaches, or restlessness. A cup of warmed wine with valerian root, for example, was thought to calm the nerves. Peppermint for digestion, aniseed for bad breath, which, let's just say, would have been welcome in a shared bed. This wasn't modern pharmacology, but it was a functional system. Trial and error, superstition, and the occasional miracle cure made with whatever was growing in the herb garden outside. And here's something else worth noting. People talked during these nightcaps. With the chores done, the fires burning low, and the wind wailing outside like a haunted kettle, families and servants would gather near the hearth with mugs in hand and voices low. They'd tell stories, share gossip, offer prayers, whisper songs. The warm drink in hand wasn't just a thermal solution, it was social glue, a signal that the day was ending and the night could begin. You finish your ale, placing the empty mug near the hearth where it can dry. The warmth from your drink has started to fade, but the memory of it clings like a layer under your skin. You rise slowly, wrap yourself in your robe, and head toward your bed. Tonight, the sheets won't feel quite so icy. The air won't seem quite so cruel, your stomach is full, your body softened by spice and heat. You're ready. As you climb into bed, the dog follows and flops down in its usual spot at your feet, still snoring, still radiating heat like a canine coal stove. You tug the blankets over your shoulders, close the curtain shutters, and breathe in the faint scent of cinnamon and clove that still lingers in the air. It's a comfort that crosses time, this quiet ritual of warmth. And as you drift towards sleep, you realize something very medieval and very true. Survival is in the details, in the mugs, the herbs, the shared warmth, the firelight flickering on stone. You've made it another night in the cold, and for now, that's more than enough. Tonight, your bed feels even colder than usual. The fire's doing its best, but it's losing the battle against the endless stone, and the dog, traitor that it is, has decided to curl up near the hearth instead of your feet. The wind whistles through the shuttered window with the kind of determination usually reserved for tax collectors. You lie there, staring into the dark, layered like a human lasagna in wool, linen, and whatever fur you manage to scavenge, wondering how anyone willingly chose to live like this. And then you remember the monks. Because if you think sleeping in a drafty castle chamber is brutal, imagine doing it on purpose. Imagine choosing a sewn cell, thin bedding, no fire, and maybe, a little mat of straw to keep your body off the floor, all in the name of spiritual purity. Welcome to the world of monastic winter nights. You pull the blanket tighter and let your mind wander to the cold stone cloisters of a medieval abbey, where men and women devoted their lives to God's silence and a daily routine that would make most people sprint for the nearest tavern. The monks didn't just deal with the cold, they embraced it, or at least they tried to. A typical monk's sleeping arrangement was sparse. No canopy bed, no heavy tapestries, just a narrow wooden cot, a straw-stuffed mattress if they were lucky, and a wool blanket, maybe two if the monastery had a good year and no one stole from the laundry line. In colder regions like England, northern France, or the Alps, monasteries were basically glorified refrigerators. The stone walls trapped cold the way gossip traps scandal, deeply and for a very long time. And forget private chambers. Monks often slept in dormitories, long rooms lined with identical beds or cots. There was no room for personalisation, no chance of adding a cute little fox fur throw. Everyone wore the same thing to bed, their habit. Yes, the same thick, itchy woolen robe they wore during the day. No pyjamas, no nightcaps. Unless, of course, you counted the hood attached to their cowl, which they pulled over their head to sleep. Not for style, mind you. Just so their ears didn't fall off overnight. You wonder, lying there in your own relatively luxurious bed, how they did it. How did they not freeze? How did they sleep? The answer is part faith, part endurance, and part clever routine. First, the monks kept a strict schedule. Sleep came early, usually right after compline, the final prayer service of the evening around 7 or 8 p.m. But it didn't last long. Monks were expected to wake again around 2 a.m. for matins, one of the nighttime offices, which meant, like you learned earlier, they practiced segmented sleep too, but with far less coziness and far more chanting in the dark. Imagine it. You've just started to warm your straw mattress with your body heat when the bell tolls. You rise in the darkness, grope for your sandals or wooden clogs, and shuffle, half frozen, down a stone corridor to the chapel. No fire, no candles, those were expensive and rationed. Just darkness, breath visible in the front of your face, and the soft shuffle of other cold, sleeping monks around you. And still they did it every night, for years, sometimes for life. Now here's the part that really makes you question your tolerance for cold. In many monastic orders, comfort was considered a threat to the soul, so being cold, that was actually good. A spiritual exercise. Suffering built character, or at the very least burned off a few sins. Some even believed sleeping too warmly made the body lazy and the mind sinful. So instead of stoking fires and fluffing featherbeds, monks thanked God for the opportunity to freeze in his name. Talk about commitment, but they weren't completely foolish. Despite their vows, monks and abbots were still human. In the harshest winters, monasteries made small allowances, a few extra blankets, shared body heat, strategically chosen sleeping areas, like beds near the kitchen wall or close to an interior corridor instead of next to an exterior-facing wall. Some abbeys had warming rooms, small chambers with a fire used to dry clothes, copy manuscripts, or thaw out monks who looked suspiciously blue in the face. There are records of monks stuffing their beds with hot stones from the fire, yes, just like everyone else, or heating bricks and placing them beneath their robes before crawling into bed. Others slept with gloves or thick woolen socks, or even with their heads fully wrapped in linen. Not exactly elegant, but when the alternative is frostbitten earlobes, fashion loses its grip pretty fast. One particularly quirky bit of historical evidence? In the rule of Saint was Benedict, the gold standard for monastic living. There are no specific rules about heating or bedding, but there are rules about not grumbling, which means monks were probably definitely grumbling about how cold it was, enough that someone had to write it down and tell them to stop. A wholly passive-aggressive footnote, if ever there was one. There's debate among historians about whether monks really endured all this suffering without cheating. Some say many monasteries had secret stashes of blankets, or that higher-ranking members enjoyed warmer quarters while novices froze in the dormitory. Others argue that exaggerating the suffering made for better storytelling, and that practical warmth solutions were much more common than the surviving records let on. After all, monks wrote their own histories. Who's going to admit that Brother Thomas snuck a cat into bed for warmth? But regardless of how strictly each rule was followed, the idea remained the same. Sleep was a discipline, cold was a test, and surviving the night without complaining was part of the spiritual grind. You look over at your dog, who has now claimed both the warmest spot by the fire and your pillow, and you can't help but laugh softly. You're not a monk. You're not sleeping in a stone cell in sun, wrapped in scratchy robes and contemplating your sins. You've got your blankets, your warming stone, your thick socks, and you're still cold, but not miserable, not alone, and definitely not chanting at 2 a.m. in an unheated chapel. So maybe you can stop complaining for once too. You roll over and pull the covers tighter, grateful for every layer, every ember, and every small mercy between you and the cold stone beneath. Because you might not be holy, but you do appreciate a warm bed. The next morning begins with hooves. You hear them before you see anything, the clop, clop, clop of horses in the courtyard muffled by packed snow, but unmistakable all the same. You drag yourself out of bed, rubbing your eyes and bracing for the cold that rushes in the moment you push aside the curtain. Your breath instantly clouds the air. It's colder than yesterday. Much colder. Your toes immediately regret existing. And judging by the sound of bustling voices and creaking wooden wheels outside, it's not just another day at home in the castle. Someone's going on a journey. Travelling in the Middle Ages was already a nightmare of mud, bruised tailbones, and the very real threat of being robbed by men with terrible teeth. But in winter, it was a logistical death wish wrapped in a sheepskin cloak. Still, people did travel. Nobles, messengers, clerics, even merchants. And when they did, they had to bring their creature comforts with them, especially if they wanted to sleep without losing half their extremities to frostbite. You peer out the window, your fingers clutching the shutters to block the wind. A small company is preparing to ride out. You count half a dozen horses, 2 ox-drawn carts, a few bundled-up servants, and one lord who looks about as thrilled as you feel. He's dressed for the journey, layers upon layers of wool and fur, a thick cloak draped over his shoulders, and boots so bulky they look more like boiled cows than footwear. He's also got something unusual being loaded into the cart. Bedrolls. Yes, even the highborn had to rough it sometimes, but not without their bedding. You step away from the window, still freezing, and your mind paints a picture of what it meant to travel warm in the medieval world. A nobleman didn't just climb into a saddle and hope for the best. He brought his bed with him. Not the full wooden 4-poster monstrosity with velvet curtains, mind you, but enough to approximate it. A travel bedroll might include a feather-stuffed mattress, or pad, or layered woolen blankets, furs, and sometimes even a canopy frame that could be assembled over a cot or inside a tent. For nobles with serious coin and connections, tents were no joke. We're talking full canvas structures with inner partitions, floors lined with carpets or rushes, and heating sources like brazier pots or even travelling stoves. It was the medieval version of glamping, minus the marshmallows and Bluetooth speakers. And here's the really wild part. Some nobles travelled with portable fireplaces, small, brazier-style metal bowls filled with charcoal designed to burn slow and hot. These could be placed inside tents with hopefully a vent or opening to provide heat. There were even early forms of metal foot warmers, little boxes filled with coals tucked under blankets or used in carriages to keep toes from going numb during long rides. You wrap your own cloak tighter around your shoulders and imagine being on the road in this weather. The nights would be brutal. After riding for hours in sleet or snow, you'd need to stop at a manor, monastery, or, if you were desperate, an inn. And inns in the Middle Ages were an experience. At best, you got a shared room with a straw mattress and a tiny fire. At worst, you got fleas, frostbite, and a guy named Gregor snoring directly into your ear. That's why people often travelled with their own bedding, not just for comfort, but for sanitation. Sleeping in a bed someone else had used without changing the straw, a fast track to catching whatever they had last week. So nobles brought their own linens, their own blankets, even their own pillows, and if they didn't bring a tent, they'd request a room with a fireplace and have their servants haul in their gear to make the place bearable. No fire in the room? You heated bricks in the common hearth and carried them upstairs wrapped in cloth. Again, small miracles, big survival. But what about everyone else? The messengers, merchants, soldiers, pilgrims? They didn't have carts of bedding or silk-trimmed tents. They had cloaks, oilcloths, and the fine art of layering. Many slept in barns, under trees, or huddled in stables. Some found space in alehouses or the open hall of a village manor. Others just built small shelters out of branches and froze their way through the night, praying their socks stayed dry and their wineskins stayed full. Travellers would often sleep fully clothed, wrapped in their cloaks and blankets, sometimes with their horses or dogs nearby for warmth. Saddlebags doubled as pillows, cloaks doubled as tents, and if you were lucky, you had a fire to sleep beside, though keeping one going all night in the open wasn't always possible. Many just curled up and endured, waking every hour to shift position and shake the cold out of their bones. Now here's a fringe detail for you. There were some who travelled with bed tents, tiny personal enclosures, like pop-up privacy booths made of cloth and poles. These were rare and mostly reserved for high-ranking individuals, but they worked surprisingly well. They didn't provide heat, but they blocked wind and held in body warmth. Think of them like a fabric igloo you could assemble on the road, preferably on a soft pile of straw or sheepskin. Fashionable? No. Effective? Absolutely. Historians are still piecing together how common some of these practices were. Some argue that travelling with such elaborate setups was only feasible for the ultra-rich. Others suggest that over time, clever merchants and even knights on campaign developed lighter, more portable solutions, like layered bedding rolls, fire pots with lids, and double-wrapped wool cloaks soaked in oil to block the wind. Whatever the truth, one thing is clear: nobody travelled in winter without a plan, or if they did, they didn't make it far. Back at the window, the company is finally moving out. The Lord hoists himself into the saddle with all the grace of a man who regrets everything, and the oxen creak into motion, pulling their cargo, bedrolls, supplies, food, firewood. You close the shutter and step away, rubbing your hands together, not just to fight the chill, but out of a strange admiration. Because while it's easy to picture medieval travel as grim and miserable, and let's be honest, often was, There was also a kind of stubborn brilliance to it. People found ways to bring a sliver of warmth with them into the wilderness, to create islands of comfort in a frozen world. Whether it was a wool blanket, a hot brick, or a fire burning inside a smoky tent, the message was the same. We're not going to freeze without a fight. You return to your own bed, grateful for the walls around you, the fire in the hearth, and the loyal dog finally reclaiming its spot near your legs. You don't envy the travellers, but you respect them. And tonight, as you curl under the blankets, you do so with the understanding that even on the road, even in the coldest corner of the kingdom, people still manage to sleep. Maybe not well, maybe not warm, but they slept. And that's no small thing. You're standing in front of a window now. Well, calling it a window might be generous. It's more like a narrow slit in the stone, barely wide enough to fit your arm through, with a crooked wooden shutter that creaks on iron hinges every time the wind gets aggressive. You nudge it open just a hair and immediately regret it. The cold pushes in like it's been waiting outside all day just to slap you in the face. You slam it shut again with a muttered curse, wedge a bit of linen in the crack and lean back wondering, not for the first time, how people manage to sleep in rooms with this level of draft proofing. Which is to say none. Welcome to the medieval window experience where glass is rare, insulation is a myth, and the cold is your most consistent house guest. The truth is, windows in castles weren't designed with comfort in mind. They were defensive features first, decorative second, and barely functional third. Many of them were little more than arrow slits, narrow vertical gaps in the stone designed for archers to shoot from, not for your viewing pleasure or natural light. If you were lucky enough to have a larger window in your bedchamber, congratulations. You now had a bigger hole through which winter could ruin your life. You walk over to the other side of the room and check a second window, this one a bit wider. It has a shutter too, but there's something stretched across the opening behind it. Not glass, not even horn. It's a sheet of oiled linen, translucent, yellowed and stiff. It lets in light, sort of, but it definitely doesn't block the cold. And yet, this was one of the best options available in much of the medieval world. Before glass became even marginally common in domestic buildings, windows were often covered with materials that tried their best to imitate it. Oiled cloth was a go-to, linen or canvas soaked in animal fat or resin to make it water-resistant and just clear enough to let sunlight in. It didn't insulate well, but it beat a raw hole in the wall. In some regions, people used thin sheets of horn scraped and flattened to create semi-transparent panels. Horn was expensive and not particularly clear, but it could be cut into small panes and fitted into wooden lattices to form rudimentary windows. Still, the cold got in. Always. Glass did exist, of course, but it was for the rich, the pious, or both. Churches got stained glass, lords got small leaded panes, and everyone else made do with ingenuity and prayers. The earliest glass windows were thick, bubbly, and greenish from impurities. They didn't offer a crystal clear view, but that wasn't the point. The point was to keep some of the weather out, and to show off. If you had glazed windows in your manor, that wasn't just an architectural choice, that was a flex. You reach up and feel around the frame of the shutter. There's a strip of fabric tucked into the edges, something like a medieval draft stopper. People would stuff wool, straw, or rags into the cracks around windows and doors to block the cold. It didn't last long, and it had to be replaced regularly, but it helped. Anything to slow the constant invasion of winter air. Some rooms had interior curtains drawn across the window during the night, not for privacy, because let's face it, your neighbours were usually chickens or cousins, but to stop drafts. These weren't your grandmother's floral drapes. They were heavy, stiffer, with soot and use, and hung from iron rods or nailed directly into the wall. In fancier homes, they might be embroidered or dyed with natural pigments. In more humble spaces, they were patchwork wool or old sacks. Either way, they served the same purpose, survival. Now here's a fascinating little fringe fact. In some late medieval homes, especially in cities like London or Paris, people began experimenting with shuttered window hoods, wooden boxes built over the inside of the window, almost like a mini chimney hood but horizontal. They were designed to catch light during the day and seal in heat at night. A clever little workaround and maybe the distant ancestor of today's insulated window treatments. Point is, medieval folks weren't just passively freezing in their homes. They were inventing, adapting, working with what they had, and what they had was often not great. You open the shutter again just to crack and peek outside. Snow clings to the sill. The wind is relentless. You imagine trying to sleep directly beneath this thing. The draft would stroke your face like a ghost with cold hands. Many people avoided putting beds near windows for this exact reason. If they had any choice at all, they placed their beds against inner walls, close to fireplaces, and as far from openings as possible. That's not to say every castle was a wind tunnel. Some later medieval buildings had clever architectural features, double window systems, recessed frames, even shutters with angled slats to redirect wind. In wealthy homes, servants would open shutters during the day to let light in and close them well before sunset to trap residual warmth. But again, all of this was imperfect, and every window, no matter how fancy, was a vulnerability. You lean back against the cold wall and think about all the people who slept under these conditions, not just in castles, but in cottages, taverns, manors, and townhouses. How many nights were spent curled away from the window, shoulders hunched, blankets piled high, trying to outlast the draft? How many times did someone wake up with frost rhyming the inside of their shutter, or snow drifting in through a broken panel? Windows were beautiful, windows were necessary, and windows were the cold's favourite shortcut into your life. There's a debate, of course. Some historians argue that the real cold didn't get into homes through windows so much as through the roof and floor. That heat loss through badly made thatch and unsealed foundations did far more damage than a bit of wind sneaking past a shutter. Others claim that windows, especially larger ones in newer constructions, were the Achilles heel of medieval warmth. Either way, the result was the same. People slept in rooms where the air moved constantly and never in a good way. You close the shutter again, wedge the fabric tighter into the frame and step back toward your bed. The fire is burning lower now, but the coals still glow red. The dog is curled up by the hearth, the smart little traitor. You slide under the covers, wrap the blankets tight around your shoulders, and listen to the wind rattle against the window. That little rectangle of nothing cut into stone has let in more cold than you thought possible, and yet, for all its flaws, it's still part of the room's rhythm. You learn to live with the cold. To fight it, to boffy, to block it, to layer yourself in fabric and hope it doesn't sneak in tonight. And when it does, as it always does, you pull the blanket higher and tell yourself, like they did for centuries, at least it's not raining. You wake to silence, real absolute prisoners. No footsteps in the hallway, no fire crackling, no dog snoring near your feet. Just the heavy, muffled stillness that only arrives with snow. You open your eyes and see a faint light glowing through the curtain, but it's not warm. It's the kind of pale light that reflects off frost and makes everything look ghostly. You sit up, slowly peeling back the layers of blankets and brace for the usual slap of cold. But it's not a slap, it's a bit of full-on body tackle. The air in the room has teeth this morning. You grope around for your cloak, which you had the good sense to leave draped over the end of the bed. It's stiff with cold. Even the wool feels like it's turned to stone. As you shuffle to the window and crack the shutter open a couple inches, you're hit with a burst of frigid air and the dazzling sight of snow piled thick across the courtyard below. White as bone, smooth as icing, and clearly here to stay for a while. The cold is worse today, but you're ready. Why? Because you're surrounded by wool. And in the Middle Ages, wool was everything. It's hard to overstate just how essential this one material was to medieval survival. Wool was clothing, bedding, insulation, curtain, and they're, in a pinch, a sort of social currency. You pull your cloak tighter and look around the room with fresh eyes. The tapestries on the wall, wool. The thick curtain across the door, wool. The blankets on your bed, the robe hanging by the hearth, even the small rug by the fire, all wool. It was the material that stood between you and a slow, shivering descent into pneumonia. And if you were poor, it was probably the only thing you owned that could keep you alive through a brutal winter. Wool was warm, yes, but it was also water-resistant, naturally flame-retardant, and surprisingly durable. When spun thick and woven tight, it created dense fabrics that trapped heat like a furnace and shrugged off damp like a duck's back. Even when wet, wool retained heat better than almost any other fabric available at the time. Linen might feel softer, and fur might look more glamorous. But wool? Wool was the workhorse of the medieval wardrobe. You head over to the fire, or what's left of it, and poke around in the ashes. A few coals are still glowing. Good. You grab a small bundle of kindling and lay it carefully over the embers. With a few steady breaths and some coaxing, a flame flickers to life. The room begins to change almost immediately. You can't see it yet, but you can feel it. heat slowly peeling the chill from the stone walls like a second skin coming loose. As you wait for the fire to grow, you look down at your boots, thick leather lined with, wool. Pulling them on is a minor battle, as the cold leather fights against the shape of your foot, but once they're on, you feel infinitely better. You throw a wool shawl over your shoulders for good measure. Now you're layered like a shepherd headed into a blizzard, which, all things considered, isn't too far from the truth. Wool was everywhere in the medieval world, not just in homes but in the economy. England in particular built much of its wealth on the back of sheep, literally. The wool trade was massive, fueling everything from local village markets to international exports. Monasteries owned vast flocks and grew rich off their fleeces. Towns developed reputations based on the quality of their spinning and weaving, and entire wars were funded with wool taxes. So when you wrap yourself in wool here, you're not just keeping warm, you're wrapping yourself in the economic engine of the age. You walk over to the bed and examine the covers again, now appreciating their construction. The outermost blanket is tightly woven, almost like felt. It's heavy, but it holds in warmth like a charm. Beneath that is another layer, this one softer, maybe brushed or fulled to raise the nap and create a fuzzy surface that traps even more heat. The sheets are linen, but every insulating layer above is good, reliable wool. And yes, they itch. That's the price of survival. You think for a moment about how much work went into making just one of these blankets. First, the sheep had to be raised and sheared, by hand of course. Then the wool had to be cleaned, carded, spun into thread, dyed if desired, and woven on a loom. It was labour intensive and it took time, but the result was something that lasted years, even decades if cared for properly. Some families passed down woolen blankets like heirlooms, not because they were beautiful, but because they worked. There's a debate among textile historians, yes, that's a thing, and yes, they're fascinating, about just how insulating medieval wool garments and furnishings were compared to modern ones. Some believe that the roughness of the wool and the looser weave meant less thermal efficiency. Others argue that the density of the fabrics, especially when fulled or felted, was more than enough to keep out even the worst drafts. Either way, people used wool for centuries in every form imaginable, and they made it work. You glance toward the shuttered window again and notice something interesting. A rolled woolen cloth stuffed into the sill. It's been wedged there to stop the draft, and it's doing a decent job. In many homes, people would keep long tubes of wool-stuffed fabric, draft snakes basically, on hand for exactly this purpose. Lay them along the floor near the door, pack them into the windows, drape them over cracks. Medieval weatherproofing, one scrap at a time. Some people even wore wool to bed. Long tunics, hoods, socks, mittens, all spun from the same sheep-powered source. And if they couldn't afford the good stuff, they used second-hand scraps. Patchwork quilts weren't just charming, they were practical ways to combine worn-out pieces of cloth into something warm enough to keep your heart beating through a January night. You return to your now crackling fire, hands stretched out to catch the warmth, and feel a little more respect for the pile of scratchy fabric you're wrapped in. Wool may not be soft, it may not be glamorous, but it is trustworthy, dependable, honest. And when the snow piles high and the wind wails at your shutter, that's what matters. Tonight, when you slide back into bed, it won't be the stone walls or the fire that keeps you alive. It'll be wool, stubborn, scratchy, sheep-scented wool, and you wouldn't trade it for anything. The fire is down to its last lazy embers when the door creaks open, letting in a gust of cold air and something even more chilling: responsibility. A servant enters, bundled head to toe, their breath fogging as they cross the threshold like a walking draft. You don't move. You're cocooned in blankets, eyes barely open, half pretending to still be asleep. But they're already at the hearth, kneeling, poking the ashes, feeding kindling into the coals with a practiced rhythm born from repetition. Daily, brutal repetition. Because while you were snoring under wool and drooling on a feather pillow, someone else was already up, hauling firewood in the dark. Servants were the invisible warmth makers of the medieval world. They stoked fires, laid out fresh rushes, emptied chamber pots, warmed bricks, aired bedding, and ensured that when the lords and ladies finally stretched and yawned, the room had stopped resembling the inside of a stone tomb. Without them, the castle didn't function, and certainly didn't stay warm. You finally sit up, the chill biting through the crack between your shoulder and the blanket, as the servant continues working. You watch them move, efficient, quiet, careful not to disturb you more than necessary. They reach into a small sack and pull out what looks like a chunk of peat. placing it gently into the growing flame. Peat burns slow and hot, perfect for keeping a low fire alive through the morning. Another smart trick, one that only works when someone's already awake and thinking ahead while you're still snoring. And here's the kicker. Most of the warmth you enjoyed last night didn't come from the fire, or even the thick wool on your bed. It came from labour, hours of work, unseen and unthanked, performed in the cold, often before the sun rose. The servant's job didn't start with the fire. It started with chopping wood the day before, gathering kindling, checking the hearth, making sure the chimney wasn't clogged, then waking before dawn, climbing freezing stairs with numb hands and hoping the embers hadn't died overnight. Fire maintenance was an art form, and in a castle it was constant. A single hearth couldn't heat more than one room at a time, and the warmth faded fast the moment the flames died. That meant every room required its own fire, each with its own woodpile, its own ashes, and its own caretaker. Servants had to be ready with tongs, bellows, and kindling, upstairs, downstairs, sometimes both at once. It was like trying to keep a dozen sleepy dragons alive, with nothing but dry sticks and an aching back. You pull your blanket tighter around your shoulders and watch as the servant turns to your bed. Without a word, they pick up a warming pan, a long-handled brass vessel, and open the lid. From the faint glow, you can tell it's filled with hot coals. They slide it between the sheets at the foot of the bed, moving it slowly to avoid scorching the fabric, and let it rest there for a few seconds before removing it. It's a quick job, just enough to knock the edge off the chill before you climb back in tonight. Warming pans were lifesavers, literally, especially in regions where winter cold wasn't just uncomfortable, but deadly. And guess who prepared those pans? Filled them with coals from the kitchen hearth, carried them up multiple floors, shook them gently between sheets and cleaned out the ash afterward. Not the lord of the manor, definitely not the lady. It was the servant. Again, even your precious hot water came with effort. If you were lucky enough to wash your face in the morning with warm water, poured into a basin near the fire, it was because someone lit the kitchen hearth at dawn, boiled it, lugged it up in a heavy pot, and poured it carefully into a pitcher you'd never even glance at. For the wealthy, the idea of warmth was seamless. For the servants, it was a chore list longer than a royal banquet. And while we're on the subject, let's not forget about the laundry. Think about all those wool blankets, all those linen sheets, the furs, the tunics worn to bed. Eventually, they needed cleaning. And medieval laundry day wasn't a charming little washboard scene by a sunny stream. It was a grueling, freezing, days-long slog. Heating vats of water, scrubbing cloth with lye, rinsing with cold water that bit like knives, then hanging heavy, dripping fabrics in icy courtyards while your hands went numb. All to ensure you had something warm and vaguely clean to sleep in. There's a fringe theory that some medieval lords developed such an affinity for their bedding, not just the comfort, but the smell of freshly aired linen, that they would keep their favourite sheets even when travelling. That meant servants had to haul them from one manor to another, air them out daily, and even perfume them with dried lavender or rosemary if the master was particularly fussy. That lavender sachet tucked in your pillow. It didn't get there by magic. Now, let's talk fuel. Firewood wasn't just lying around for the taking. It had to be chopped, seasoned, stacked, and rationed. In some places, peat or dried animal dung substituted for logs. Less romantic, more pungent. Servants managed all of it, and they knew how many logs a room would need through the night. They kept track of the piles. They ran in and out of the bitter wind all day just to maintain enough fuel to prevent frostbite. Historians debate just how grueling the work was. Some suggest that in larger castles, hearth-keeping was divided among several workers, each with specific rooms or shifts. Others argue that most warming tasks fell to a small, overworked handful of scullions and lower servants, many of them children or teens. But the consistent fact is this. The warm bed you enjoy was not the product of medieval architecture or clever design, it was the product of sweat. And as the servant finishes tidying your rushes, stokes the fire one last time, and begins to quietly withdraw, you catch yourself murmuring something unusual for the 14th century. Thank you. They pause, startled, and give you a nod, half respectful, half surprised. Because gratitude isn't a common currency here. Servants aren't thanked for doing their job, they're expected to be invisible, efficient, and solent. But today, maybe, the colds reminded you that your comfort was never self-made. You lay back in bed, now warmed at the feet and glowing faintly from the revived fire. The servants' footsteps fade down the hall. The castle is still cold, but it could be colder. It has been, and it would be every single day without the quiet hands that light fires, carry coals, air linens, and do it all again the next morning. Because in the medieval world, you don't survive winter with courage, you survive it with help. Night falls like a slow sigh, and with it comes a hush that settles over the castle like frost on a window pane. You're wrapped in your now familiar cocoon of wool and linen, the dog a lump of fur at your feet, the fire reduced to a whisper of orange glow. Everything feels still, too still. As you lie there staring at the dark ceiling, you suddenly remember this is the hour when things go bump in the night. And in the Middle Ages, people didn't just fear the cold, they feared what came with it. Because cold wasn't just a physical problem, it was a spiritual one. A doorway in the medieval mind through which all sorts of unpleasant things might creep. Demons, spirits, nightmares, illnesses carried by bad air. You shift slightly under the blankets, the chill curling around your toes, and you can almost hear your long-dead great-aunt whispering something ominous like, "Don't fall asleep with cold feet or the devil will sneak into your dreams." You'd laugh, but honestly, it feels a little too quiet tonight. In the medieval worldview, nighttime was full of invisible dangers. Darkness alone was enough to trigger unease, but winter darkness, prolonged, bitter, and bone-deep, was especially menacing. When the fire died down and the windows frosted over, it wasn't just an environmental discomfort, it was a thinning of the veil. The cold, many believed, didn't just stiffen your fingers, it invited things. You hear a creak from the hallway. Nothing dramatic, just old wood adjusting. But your heart taps a little faster because in a medieval castle, those sounds had stories attached to them. People believed spirits were more active during the cold months, especially at night, when the sun was gone and God's warmth was furthest from the earth. The long winter dark was when witches flew, ghosts moaned, and demons paid visits to those whose souls, or feet, were poorly protected. And here's where things get real weird. To protect against these nightly visitations, people developed entire rituals, not just prayers before bed, though those were common too, but physical actions meant to guard the body from cold and the soul from infiltration. Tying a red string around the ankle, laying an iron knife under the pillow, spitting 3 times into the hearth, hanging a sprig of rowan or garlic above the bed curtain, even sleeping with a Bible open face down on your chest. Medieval bedtime was defensive and, like spiritual armour, layered as carefully as your blankets. You pull the covers up over your shoulder and think about the phrase night air. Back then it wasn't just a poetic term, it was a health threat. Doctors, monks and folk healers alike warned against exposure to cold air after dark. It was believed to carry miasmas, invisible, noxious vapours that seeped into your lungs and made you sick. If you left a window open at night, you were just begging for disease to blow in. Even healthy people were advised to sleep with their mouths covered, just in case the devil rode the draft into your body. One quirky example of this fear, some folks would stuff herbs into their bed linens, not for scent, but for spiritual protection. Wormwood, mugwort and rue were thought to ward off spirits and sickness. You might even find a little bundle of dried herbs sewn into a child's pillow or tied to a bedpost. Smelled awful, but then again, so did everything else in winter. There's also the tale of old hag syndrome, a real sleep phenomenon that people back then blamed on supernatural interference. If you woke in the night unable to move, your chest heavy and your breath short, it wasn't sleep paralysis. It was the witch sitting on your chest. The only solution? Rare, protective talismans, or, if you could afford it, a charm made by a village wise woman. One particularly strange cure involved sleeping with a raw onion under your bed. If your chamber smelled like a stew pot in the morning, congratulations, the witch passed you by. And speaking of witches, winter nights were their favourite playground. Villagers whispered about curses cast under moonlight, spells laid over frozen wells, or strange lights seen flickering near the woods. If you had a headache or fever during a particularly cold stretch of nights, someone was likely to suggest you'd been hexed in your sleep. Better see the priest, or the herbalist, or both, just to cover your bases. Even more respectable medieval scholars bought into this stuff. Theologians warned of the dangers of impure thoughts at night, especially during long winter evenings, when the mind wandered and the cold made you sluggish. One late-night sin, they claimed, could open the door to demonic temptation. And don't even think about having a bad dream that meant something got in. You shift under the blankets again, less because you're cold now and more because you feel the weight of the night pressing in. Not scary exactly, just heavy. Like the air is thick with old stories. And maybe that's the real danger of winter. Not the chill in your bones, but the way the darkness makes you remember. All the things you've heard, all the stories told around a dying fire. The kinds of tales that sound silly at noon, but gain teeth by candlelight. There's debate among historians about how seriously people took these fears. Some argue that the stories were mostly symbolic, allegories for sin, death, and seasonal depression. Others insist these beliefs were visceral, lived realities that shaped everything from bedtime routines to room design. Why else would people sleep with their heads as far from the window as possible? Why else keep a candle lit until the oil ran out? And yet fear isn't always irrational. When your world is cold, dark and loud with creaks and howls, fear is a form of caution. It keeps you from opening the window too wide. It makes you double-check the fire before bed. It reminds you to whisper that little prayer, just in case. In a time when science hadn't yet untangled the mystery of dreams or infection, superstition was your bedtime strategy. You close your eyes and try to settle, the dog's gentle breathing a comfort against the backdrop of wind. Your bed is warm now, your body wrapped in wool, your soul mostly calm. But as you drift towards sleep, you remember to do what thousands did before you. You whisper a small blessing, you tuck the covers under your feet, and you don't, absolutely don't, look at the window, just in case something's looking back. The room is quiet again, but this time in a gentler way. The wind has eased, the fire has settled into a red glowing cradle of coals, and even the dog, who has resumed his rightful spot at your feet, has stopped twitching in his sleep. You stretch, vaguely aware of the stiffness in your limbs, and shift beneath the layers of wool and linen. And there it is again, that eternal medieval bedtime conundrum. How do you stay warm and be a functional human being when nature calls at 3 a.m? The answer, as it turns out, is very carefully. Because for all the sleeping strategies, the fire tending, the layered clothing, and the herd animal bed sharing, there's one frigid truth you can't avoid. Eventually, you're going to need to pee, and in the dead of winter, in a drafty stone castle with stairs colder than sin and a privy located approximately 6 miles from your bed, or so it feels, that's not just an inconvenience. It's a full-blown psychological war. You lie still for a few minutes, trying to bargain with your bladder. Maybe you can wait until morning. Maybe if you shift a little, the need will pass. Maybe if you go back to sleep, your body will magically absorb the problem. All solid plans, until the pressure becomes non-negotiable. With a sigh of pure dread, you throw back the covers and plant your feet on the cold stone floor. It's like stepping into a frozen lake made of sadness. Fortunately, medieval folks had a workaround, the chamber pot. And while it's not glamorous, it beats the alternative, which usually involves frostbite, emotional trauma, and a moonlit sprint across a courtyard. You shuffle toward the heavy ceramic vessel tucked into the corner, its curved sides catching the faint firelight like a porcelain ghost. The chamber pot was an essential item in any medieval bedroom, from the humblest peasant cottage to the grandest noble chamber. Often placed discreetly under the bed or behind a screen, it was the medieval night owl's best friend, and possibly the only thing standing between you and a life-threatening chill. You use it quickly, hissing at the cold, then shuffle back into bed, stuffing your feet under the still warm dog who sighs like you've offended him personally. You lie there in the dark, blankets pulled high, and can't help but wonder, how did people make intimacy work in this kind of cold? Because let's be honest, cuddling's one thing, trying to be romantic in a room where your breath fogs and the chamber pot's still warm is another story. Medieval couples had to get creative. In noble households, shared beds were common for married pairs, especially when children weren't in them. That closeness wasn't just emotional, it was strategic. 2 bodies, 1 bed, 1 mission, survive the night. You'd sleep back to back or front to front, sharing heat like coals under a blanket. Even in frigid rooms, body warmth could turn a wool-wrapped cave into something resembling comfort. But it wasn't always together. Some noble couples slept in separate beds, or even separate rooms. Privacy, health concerns, and social custom all played a role. In fact, sleeping apart wasn't necessarily a sign of a distant marriage. It could simply be a way to ensure better rest. After all, when your partner is a loud snorer, a bed hog, or someone who sweats like a medieval forge, you might want a little breathing room. Of course, for most people, especially lower down the social ladder, privacy was a fantasy. Beds were shared not just by couples, but by children, siblings, even unrelated travellers. Peasant cottages might have only one sleeping area, meaning everyone piled in like sheep in a barn. In those settings, intimacy became a matter of timing. If you wanted a quiet moment with your spouse, you had to be stealthy, or wait until the kids fell asleep, or, in more dire cases, not care at all if they were awake. Some sources, usually written by monks or moralists with too much time on their hands, warned against sharing warmth too much. Lust thrives in warm bulb and beds, one famously prudish clergyman once wrote. The advice? Sleep separately, avoid excessive physical contact, and definitely don't laugh together under the covers. Laughter, apparently, was a gateway to all sorts of sinful activity. Who knew? But despite the finger-wagging, real people found ways to stay close, physically and emotionally, even when the room felt like an icebox. Bedding down together became part of the rhythm of life. You'd talk, whisper, complain about the draft, strategically warm each other's feet. Some couples even turned the cold into foreplay, because when the air stings and the fire's almost out, shared heat becomes genuinely sensual. There's even a quirky historical tidbit about warming the bed as an act of affection. A partner might lie in bed first, absorbing the chill, so their spouse could climb in later without suffering. In some noble circles, this became almost ceremonial, sending a servant to warm the sheets before the couple retired. Whether that involved a hot pan, a heated brick, or just lying there like a sacrificial lamb is open to interpretation. Still, for all the closeness, there were limits. When someone got sick, and they always did, especially in winter, separating beds became a matter of health. Colds, fevers, even plague. You'd want as much distance as you could manage. In wealthier households, someone would move to another room. In smaller homes, they'd simply sleep at the foot of the bed or on a pallet near the hearth. Intimacy paused. Survival came first. There's a scholarly debate about how much sex actually happened during winter months in medieval Europe. Some argue that long nights and proximity led to more romance. Others point to religious restrictions, many holy days and fasting periods discouraged sexual activity, and argue that winter was more about hibernation than passion. The truth is likely somewhere in between. People lived by practical needs and personal desire, not theological schedules. You lie back now, warm once more, the dog twitching in a dream beside you. The room is still cold, but you've adjusted. It's not comfortable exactly, but it's familiar. You've learned to live in this world of blankets, firelight, midnight pots, and whispered prayers. And as you close your eyes again, you find a strange peace in knowing that even in this stone chamber there is softness, there is closeness, there is life. Because in the medieval world, love wasn't candlelight dinners and fine wine. It was sharing a bed without elbowing each other in the ribs, taking turns with the warm side of the blanket, and laughing together, quietly of course, before the fire went out. The morning comes with less of a sunrise and more of a slow, reluctant glow behind a curtain of fog. You don't so much wake up as re-enter existence, stiff-limbed and squinting, the blanket tangled around your knees and the dog pinning down one foot like a furry paperweight. There's no alarm, of course, just the soft sounds of the castle reanimating, the distant clatter of pots in the kitchen, the slow creak of footsteps in the hall, the unmistakable thunk of someone splitting wood in the courtyard. You sit up and stretch, cracking joints like kindling, and suddenly you realise something. You didn't wake up in the middle of the night shivering. For the first time in what feels like weeks, your little corner of the world held its heat. No desperate fumbling for another blanket. No bitter drafts dragging across your face. And it wasn't a miracle, it was routine, built from hundreds of tiny intentional acts. Because the truth is, people in the Middle Ages didn't just endure the cold, they outsmarted it. You toss off your covers, grudgingly, and pull on a thick overrobe, another trusty piece of wool that's been lying near the hearth all night, soaking up ambient warmth. And as you pad over to the window, feet now used to the stone, you start thinking about all the little things, things you've seen and things you haven't, that made a warm night possible in a castle like this. First, there's placement. Medieval people weren't stupid, they knew where warmth collected. That's why your bed isn't against the outer wall. It's tucked into a corner between two interior walls as far from the window as possible. Maybe even in an alcove with a heavy curtain you draw shut at night. You've basically built yourself a fabric cave, small enough that your body heat can actually make a dent. Then there's material. You've layered linen, wool, fur, and maybe even a feather bed. Some wealthier households had mattress pads stuffed with feathers or straw, stacked on top of a rope lattice that needed to be tightened regularly, a literal sleep-tight situation. Beneath that, maybe a sheepskin or felted mat to block the cold radiating up from the floor. It's not Tempur-pedic, but it works. You've also mastered the art of staging heat. You keep a fire going as long as possible, knowing it'll die down in the night. Before bed, you use the warming pan. Maybe you heated a stone in the coals, wrapped it in cloth, and tucked it at your feet. If you're extra clever, you've got a lined bed curtain that traps warmth and blocks drafts. That heavy velvet canopy overhead is not just for drama, it's for insulation. And let's not forget the rituals. The servants rise early to relight the fires and swap out spent coals. Blankets are shaken and aired daily, not just for hygiene, but to fluff the fibres and make them more insulating. Clothes are dried near the hearth and carefully folded to avoid dampness creeping in. Everyone moves through these actions with purpose because skipping a step means losing warmth, and in the dead of winter, that's not just uncomfortable, it's risky. You glance at the hearth now, where the fire has been rekindled. A small pot of something is warming on the edge, maybe porridge, maybe weak ale, maybe just water for washing. You wrap your cloak tighter and consider the absolute genius of multitasking. In the medieval world, fire wasn't wasted on just heat. It cooked. It boiled water, it dried clothing, it melted snow for drinking, it smoked meat, sterilized knives and warmed hearts. There was a practical economy to every flicker. You sit down near the flames and stretch your hands toward them, grateful. And as you do, you think about the final piece of the puzzle, adaptation. Because really, the reason people survived winter in a freezing castle wasn't just fire or wool or shared body heat. It was their ability to adapt, to learn what worked, to teach it, to pass it down generation after generation through stories, habits, and the 1,000 small choices that kept fingers intact and spirits unbroken. People adjusted sleep patterns to match the cold. They worked during daylight and conserved energy at night. They relied on community, sharing beds, food, fuel, even the architecture adapted. Spiral staircases were built clockwise to favour right-handed defenders, but also minimised exposure to wind. Window openings were made smaller in colder climates. Doors were hung with heavy curtains to block drafts. Some castles even had floor-level flues that carried heat from kitchen hearths into upper rooms. Not exactly central heating, but close. There's a fun little fringe theory that some castles were designed with bed placement in mind. That rooms were arranged so that sleeping quarters faced east to catch morning sun, or were located above rooms with fires to soak up rising heat. There's debate among scholars, of course. Some say that's reading too much into things. Others argue that medieval people were extremely attuned to environmental design. Either way, the effect is the same: survival by architecture. You sip from a mug of something warm, maybe mulled cider, maybe watered wine, and it hits you again. Every ounce of comfort you're experiencing right now was intentional. Someone hauled the firewood. Someone spun the wool. Someone laid the stones of this wall with thick mortar to block wind. Someone decided to tuck this room into the heart of the castle, rather than along the outer wall. None of it happened by accident. And so, even though your world is still made of cold stone and flickering light, it feels a little less brutal. Because you're part of a long chain of human stubbornness. People who looked winter in the face and said, "Fine, if we can't beat it, we'll outthink it." You smile, settling closer to the fire, the dog stretching out across your toes, smug and half asleep. Outside, the world is still frozen. The fog hangs thick, the wind moans through the battlements. But in here, in this firelit pocket of wool and willpower, you're warm. And in the medieval world, that meant everything. The fire has burned low again, and for once, you don't mind. You're tucked into the bed, deep under layers of fabric that smell faintly of smoke and lavender. The room is quiet, except for the low wheeze of wind pushing at the shutters and the occasional snort from the dog curled into a furry croissant at your feet. Your feet are warm, your shoulders are covered, your nose is the only part of you braving the open air, and it tingles in the draft. You've survived another night in a medieval castle without freezing to death. And somehow you've done it with all the 10 fingers and a reasonable amount of dignity. But as you lie there, not quite ready to sleep and not quite willing to move, you start thinking back on everything you've learned. Everything that got you through. The wool, the fire, the dog, the bed curtains, the chamber pot, the hot bricks and thick blankets and sleep schedules carved around the absence of central heating. And then, because your brain can't help itself, You start thinking about all the terrible molecules, or just plain weird ways people tried and failed to stay warm. Because not every strategy was brilliant. Some were outright dumb. Take, for instance, the charcoal brazier in the bedroom. On paper, it's a solid idea. Bring in a little metal pan, fill it with glowing coals, and voila, portable heat. Except there's one massive problem: carbon monoxide. The concept of ventilation wasn't exactly widely understood in the Middle Ages, and people routinely died in their sleep from invisible poison gas seeping into their blood as they slumbered peacefully under their furs. Cosy and quietly fatal, a real 2-for-1. Then there were the dung fires. Yes, cow dung, dried and compacted into little bricks, burned for fuel when firewood ran low. Practical? Absolutely. Pleasant? Not in the slightest. The smell alone could peel the paint off a wall if medieval walls had paint, which they usually didn't. Add that to a tightly closed sleeping chamber, and congratulations, your bedroom now smells like a peasant barn during midsummer, and your clothes will reek until spring. Some people tried to warm themselves by drinking extremely strong spirits before bed. The theory was simple: alcohol makes you feel warm, so drink more of it and you'll feel warmer. Logical, sure, until you pass out with your face in a snowdrift or roll over and snuff out the embers with your leg. Not to mention the fact that alcohol lowers your core body temperature, even while it tricks you into thinking you're toasty. It was the medieval version of playing chicken with hypothermia. Then you've got your dangerously overstuffed beds. Wealthier households loved their feathers. Feather mattresses, feather pillows, feather bolsters stacked so high they threatened to eat you alive. But feathers trap moisture, and when the temperature drops, that moisture turns to chill. If you didn't dry those pillows regularly, they became soggy heat suckers, a literal cold trap disguised as a luxury. And you thought your memory foam mattress had issues. Let's not forget the open flame night lighting, candles, rush lights, oil lamps, left burning in bedrooms to ward off spirits or just make people feel less alone. Combine that with flammable bed curtains, straw mattresses, and a society that hadn't invented the fire extinguisher, and you can imagine the result. Entire rooms going up like tinderboxes. Fires that started in the bedroom often consumed entire homes. It's a miracle anyone lived long enough to be cold again. And still, they kept trying, because survival is messy, and people make mistakes. They mix herbs wrong, or fall asleep with their cloak too close to the brazier, or try to use a hot turnip as a foot warmer. Yes, that's a real thing. Some folks use their heated vegetables wrapped in cloth to warm their beds. Innovation and desperation have always been strange bedfellows. Even now, historians find it hard to agree on which medieval warming methods were safe, which were superstitious, and which were just wishful thinking. Some argue that many of these bad ideas were exaggerated later, written down by moralists who wanted to show how foolish or sinful people were. Others believe the opposite, that the surviving records understate the creativity and chaos of real medieval households. You shift slightly, your thoughts wandering. It's easy to laugh now, wrapped up warm, knowing modern heating exists somewhere out there beyond the fantasy. But if you strip it all down, what people really wanted back then wasn't luxury, it was control. Control over their environment, over the hunger, the cold, the dark, over the nights that stretched too long and the winters that dragged on like slow, bitter funerals. All those little heating hacks, from fire pans to warming ale, were just attempts to reclaim a tiny bit of comfort, to say, this is my bed, this is my room, this is my body, and tonight I choose to be warm. That instinct? It hasn't changed. You close your eyes, listening to the gentle crackle of the fire's last breath. The room is dark now, and cold air curls through the shutters in thin, hesitant streams. But it doesn't bother you. Not really. You're ready. You've got the layers, the tricks, the knowledge. You've got the dog. And as sleep pulls at you once more, you understand something about the people who lived here before you. They weren't just braving the cold, they were fighting for comfort. They were building warmth out of stubbornness and instinct. And against all odds, it worked. And now, as the last ember fades and the dog lets out one final sleepy sigh, it's time to tuck the story in with the rest of us. You've made it. Not just through one freezing night in a medieval castle, but through the layers of knowledge, grime, grit and ingenuity that kept our ancestors from becoming icicles in their own beds. You started this journey surrounded by stone walls and bone-deep chill, blinking at firelight and wondering how anyone ever managed to sleep without a thermostat. But now you know it wasn't just luck or medieval masochism. It was system, routines, wool, People who got up before dawn to carry hot bricks and stoke ashes. People who passed on their knowledge in the form of creaky beds, heavy curtains and herbs tied with string. People who endured night after night and taught the next generation how to do the same. It wasn't perfect. Some ideas were brilliant, others were frankly dangerous. But every decision, whether it involved warming pans or huddling with goats, came from the same human instinct: make it through the night. So tonight, when you climb into bed, whether it's under medieval-style wool or memory foam and central heat, maybe you'll think back to the people who slept with stone at their backs and cold air at their throats. And maybe, just maybe, you'll feel a little warmer knowing you're part of the same long story. Now blow out the candle, let the coals burn low, the shutters are closed, the blankets are heavy, and there's nothing left to do but sleep. You've earned it.